In the summer of 2017, I decided to take a solo camping trip in the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. I was 28 then, working remotely as a freelance graphic designer, and I had been feeling burnt out for months. Between deadlines, late-night edits, and client calls at odd hours, I barely stepped outside for weeks at a time. I figured some time off-grid would help clear my head. I'd camped before, usually with friends or my brother, but this was my first time going completely alone and off-trail. I wanted isolation, no campgrounds, no cell service, no people. I spent the week before preparing carefully. I packed my gear into a large, worn pack I'd used on previous trips: tent, sleeping bag, small cook stove, a bare canister with food, first aid kit, water purifier, warm clothes, my old compass, and a waterproof map. I chose a route that started at Iron Creek Trailhead and planned to veer off onto a lesser-used ridge that I'd read about on a backpacking forum. I made sure someone knew my general plan and told them when I expected to be back. I also gave myself a 2-day buffer in case I wanted to stay longer. When I got to the trailhead, it was quiet. One other car was parked at the far end, but I didn't see anyone nearby. I locked up, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The first few hours followed a gentle incline through tall pine trees, the ground soft with fallen needles. Birds chirped in the canopy overhead, and the breeze was light but constant. By late afternoon, I reached the fork where I'd planned to cut off the main trail. I checked my map twice and then turned off onto a narrow, barely there path that climbed steeply toward the ridge. The next few hours were more tiring. The trail was overgrown, sometimes completely disappearing under shrubs and rocks. I stopped several times to check my bearings, but I wasn't too worried. The sun was still high, and I'd marked a lake up on the ridge where I planned to camp the first night. When I finally got there, the light was starting to turn gold. The lake was small and still, tucked between jagged rock formations and lined with alpine trees. I dropped my pack and stood for a long minute, just taking it all in. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground overlooking the water. After filtering some water and eating a quick meal of rice and beans, I settled in. The temperature dropped fast after the sun dipped behind the mountains, and the silence was deep and almost unnerving. I had no reception, which I expected, so I left my phone off and just sat quietly, bundled in my jacket, watching the stars come out. I fell asleep quicker than I thought I would. The first night passed without issue. I woke up a couple of times, once to pee, and once because I thought I heard something moving outside, but it was probably a chipmunk or something small. Nothing to worry about. The next day, I packed up early and started hiking along the ridge toward a second, more remote lake I'd marked. The path was even rougher than before. I followed game trails most of the time, checking the map constantly. Around midday, I stopped to eat and refill water from a small stream. That second night, I camped in a small clearing above the lake, surrounded by granite boulders and twisted old trees. I found an odd set of branches stacked like a tripod near a boulder. Not natural, but not alarming. Maybe another hiker or hunter had made it. I ignored it and pitched my tent on a flat stretch of grass. As the sun set, I noticed a faint smell of smoke on the breeze. Not strong, just a trace, like an old campfire, far off. There were no trails nearby, no campsites, and I hadn't seen anyone since I left the trailhead. The smell lingered even after dark. I kept checking outside, thinking I might see a glow in the distance or hear someone, but there was nothing, just trees and wind and the quiet lapping of water below. I fell asleep eventually, though it took a while. That night, I woke up again, heart racing. I'd heard something soft, but sharp, a stick breaking, not like a chipmunk or squirrel, heavier. I held still in my sleeping bag, my ears straining. I waited maybe 10 minutes, hearing nothing else, then finally unzipped the door and shined my flashlight outside. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stepped outside and did a slow circle around the tent with the flashlight. I didn't see anything, no prints, no eyes in the dark. Just trees and grass and the sound of wind. But something had definitely moved near my camp. I slept poorly the rest of the night. The next morning, I found something that stopped me cold. About 20 feet from the tent, someone or something had moved a small pile of rocks into a perfect circle during the night. I hadn't noticed it before, and it definitely wasn't there when I set up camp. They were neatly stacked, each one placed with care. It wasn't random, and it wasn't a natural formation. That's when I felt the first real chill. I'm not a paranoid person. I don't spook easily, but I'd been alone for 2 days off any map trail, and suddenly there was a sign that someone else might be out here, and that they were close. I packed up fast, barely eating. My plan had been to hike another day and loop back, but I decided to turn around early and return to the trailhead by nightfall. It would be a long, brutal hike, but I didn't want to stay out here another night, not with whoever or whatever was nearby. I moved quickly, pushing harder than I usually would. I barely stopped except to drink or check my map. I kept glancing behind me, listening for footsteps, snapping branches, anything. I started noticing more strange signs. Rocks stacked along the trail in threes, like little markers. Once, I found a long stick stabbed into the ground, pointing directly down the ridge. It wasn't natural, and it wasn't old. The wood was freshly broken. Someone had done it recently. Around 3 p.m., I was picking my way down a steep slope, just about to reach the tree line, when I spotted movement ahead. I froze and dropped to a crouch, heart pounding. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer, but it was too tall. It was a person, definitely a person. They were standing still, facing away from me, maybe 150 feet down the hill. I couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette of someone in dark clothes, motionless. I watched for nearly a full minute. They didn't move, didn't turn, just stood there. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound. Then I turned and started bushwhacking hard to the left, away from where I'd seen them. I don't know if they saw me. I don't know if they were even real, but I didn't look back. I just kept going. By dusk, I was completely off the planned return path. I was following my compass, angling southwest, trying to intersect the main trail as fast as possible. I hadn't seen anyone else, but I still felt like I was being followed. I started hearing small noises behind me, rustling, occasional cracking branches. Every time I stopped to listen, it would go quiet. It didn't feel like an animal. It felt deliberate. I made the mistake of hiking past dark. The forest was thick, and the moon was hidden by clouds. I had my headlamp, but it barely cut through the trees. I finally gave up around 10 p.m. and pitched my tent in a narrow valley near a stream. I didn't eat. I didn't change. I just got inside and lay there, fully dressed, with the bear spray in one hand and my utility knife in the other. That night was the longest of my life. I heard someone, or something, circling my tent. It happened more than once. Soft footsteps, twigs snapping, a breathing sound once. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loud. At one point, something brushed the side of my tent. Not hard, just a fingertip touch, like someone dragging a hand along the fabric. I didn't sleep, not 1 second. As soon as the sky turned gray, I was up and packed. I didn't bother with food or water. I just followed the compass west, moving fast. I finally hit the main trail around 9 a.m. I nearly collapsed when I saw it. I followed it without stopping, knees aching, back screaming from the pack. I reached the trailhead by late afternoon. My car was still there. No other vehicles, just mine. When I got inside and locked the doors, I sat there for 10 minutes before I could even start the engine. My hands were shaking. I kept looking at the tree lean, expecting to see someone step out. I didn't. I drove straight back to Boise. Didn't stop, didn't eat, didn't turn on the radio. When I got home, I took the memory card from my camera and snapped it in half. I threw it in the trash and never looked back. I didn't want any pictures from that trip. I didn't want to remember the lakes or the sunsets or the stars. I just wanted to forget. I've never gone solo camping again. I still hike sometimes, but only on marked trails. Only where other people go. I carry a GPS now, not just a compass. I also carry a small emergency beacon. And I never ignore that tight feeling in my gut anymore. The one that tells you you're not alone. Because I wasn't. It was early August 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip up into the northern part of Montana. I was 34 then, working as a delivery driver in Missoula, and I'd gotten a week off after months of nonstop work. I'd been craving something quiet, away from my phone, work stress, and just people in general. I wanted to go somewhere far out, someplace I wouldn't hear a car engine or see a lit-up screen for a few days. That's when I found a spot near the Kootenai National Forest, way out near the Yak River area. It wasn't an official campsite or anything, just a small clearing near a stream that I'd found online on a backwoods hiker forum. Some guy had posted photos of it, mentioned it being one of his favorite places to reconnect. That was enough for me. I packed up my gear over the course of a couple days: one-person tent, sleeping bag, freeze-dried food, jet boil stove, 2 big water containers, fishing rod, bear spray, knife, headlamp, and a small first aid kit. I also brought along my old field notebook, some pencils, and a paperback novel I'd read halfway through a year ago and never finished. I didn't even bring my phone charger. I figured I'd let the battery die by the second day and just go completely off-grid. The drive out took nearly 6 hours. The last 45 minutes were on a dirt road that looked more like an old logging route. The trees on either side looked like they hadn't been trimmed in years, and branches scraped along the sides of my truck as I crept through. I had to stop once to move a downed tree branch off the road, and again when a herd of deer wandered across and just stood there staring at me. When I finally arrived at the clearing, I killed the engine and stepped out into silence. Not the kind of silence you get in your house late at night. This was deep forest silence. The kind where the only sound you hear is wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves or chirp of a bird. It smelled like pine and damp moss, and the light filtered through the canopy in that soft, broken way that makes everything look older and calmer. I set up my tent about 20 yards from the stream, on a flat patch of soft dirt surrounded by boulders and trees. I kept the fire pit small and clear of any dry brush. I cooked a quick dinner, just boiled water poured into a pouch of chicken and rice, then sat on a flat rock to eat while watching the stream move. It was just cool enough to wear a hoodie once the sun dipped behind the trees. I stayed up until it was pitch black, then crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep within minutes. The first day went smooth. I spent the morning fishing and caught 2 small trout. I let them go. I wasn't really there to eat. I just wanted to keep busy. I hiked a bit, maybe a mile or so upstream, and came across some old animal tracks, probably elk or moose. I followed them a bit before losing them in the undergrowth. There were no signs of people, no boot prints, no trash, no stumps or cleared out spaces. That was what I wanted, just untouched forest. The second night was when things started to feel a little off. I was half asleep when I heard something outside the tent. It sounded like footsteps, not heavy, but definite, slow and steady. Not the fast shuffle of a rabbit or squirrel, but the soft crunch of leaves under weight. My first thought was a deer, or maybe even a bear, though it didn't have that kind of heavy stomp. I stayed still, listening, heart pounding a little harder. The steps came closer, then stopped. I waited, holding my breath. After maybe a minute, I heard them again, this time moving away. I didn't hear any snapping branches, no huffing breath or animal sounds, just quiet. I stayed in the tent for another 10 minutes before unzipping it slowly and stepping out with the flashlight in hand. I swept the light across the trees and ground. Nothing. I didn't see any eye shine, didn't hear anything move. I walked around my campsite just once, slow, scanning everything. The air felt colder than it had earlier. I didn't see any tracks, but the ground was too dry in some spots to leave any. I went back in the tent, zipped it tight, and didn't sleep much the rest of the night. The next morning, I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe even my own imagination hyping up some natural sounds. Still, I took extra care that day. I didn't hike far. I kept my knife clipped to my belt and made more noise than usual when walking around. I tried to enjoy the day, and for the most part one did. I built a little chair out of flat rocks, made tea by the fire, even sketched a bit in my notebook. But in the back of my head, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't completely alone. That night, I stayed up later than usual. I kept the fire going and sat beside it with the knife resting on my knee. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. Around midnight, I finally put out the fire and crawled into the tent, but I didn't zip it all the way. I left the flap slightly open so I could peek out if I needed to. It wasn't long before I heard the sounds again. This time it was closer, and there was more than just footfalls. I heard something click, like a stone knocking against another. Then a soft scrape, like wood dragged across bark. My eyes were wide open, staring out of the flap, and I saw something. A shape, maybe 20 feet away, standing still. It didn't move. It was too dark to see clearly, but I knew it wasn't an animal. It was tall, upright, human. I froze. My mind raced. Who the hell was out here? I hadn't seen a soul in days. I didn't move, didn't even breathe loud. The shape stayed there, motionless, and then, just like that, it backed away slowly. No lights, no sound, just retreating into the trees. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours. Eventually, I zipped the flap shut and locked my hands around the knife handle until morning came. When the sun finally rose, I stepped out shaking. I scanned the area again, and that's when I saw it. A single boot print, half in the dirt, half on a rock, heading toward the stream. Definitely human. Size 10 or 11 maybe. I wear a 9.5. I walked around and found more. Not many, but enough to tell someone had been walking the perimeter of my camp. No gear, no wrappers, no fire. Just the prints. I decided to leave that day. I packed up everything quickly and double-checked that I wasn't leaving anything behind. I kept checking over my shoulder as I moved through the forest, especially during the long walk back to where I'd parked the truck. I kept the knife in my hand the whole time. When I finally reached the truck, I threw everything in the back, locked the doors, and didn't stop until I was 2 hours down the highway. Back in Missoula, I kept thinking about what I saw. I considered calling someone, the Forest Service maybe, but what would I say? A guy stood near my tent and didn't say anything? That wasn't a crime. Maybe it was another hiker who got lost or curious. Maybe someone who didn't want to be seen. Maybe even someone who'd been living out there in the woods. Whatever the reason, I didn't go back. Not to that area. Not alone. Stuck with me. Not because anything happened, but because of how close something almost did. The idea that someone was watching me without saying a word, without making themselves known, just standing there in the dark, that part never left me. I still go camping now sometimes, but never more than a day or two, and never alone. I always bring a satellite phone, and I let people know exactly where I'm going. That spot in the woods was beautiful. Still is, I'm sure. But there was something there. Not a ghost, not a monster, just a person. And sometimes that's worse, because you can't explain it away with a story. You just have to live with the fact that someone was out there, silent, close, and for some reason didn't want to be found. I never thought a simple camping trip could turn into something I'd never forget. My name is Ethan, I'm 27, and this happened back in the summer of 2019. I had planned this trip for weeks, a solo weekend away from the noise of the city. I chose a small, little-known state park in northern Michigan called Maple Ridge. The place was remote enough to feel like I was alone in the world, but not so wild that I would be completely cut off. I arrived late Friday afternoon. The sun was still warm, but it was dipping low behind thick pine trees that lined the dirt road leading to the campground. The air smelled of pine needles, earth, and a faint hint of smoke from distant campfires. The kind of smell that instantly calms you down after a long week of city life. I parked my old, beat-up truck in the empty lot near the trailhead and carried my backpack, tent, and supplies to a small clearing about 200 yards into the woods. It wasn't a marked campsite. I liked that. No fire pits or picnic tables, just raw forest. The ground was soft underfoot, covered with dead leaves and small twigs. I found a flat spot to set up my tent between two large oaks. As I worked on pitching the tent, I could hear birds chirping, the distant hum of insects, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The woods felt alive but quiet, like a sleeping giant breathing gently. The canopy above filtered the fading sunlight into long, soft rays that danced on the forest floor. I set up camp quickly. Tent secured, sleeping bag rolled out, small backpack of food nearby. I gathered a handful of dry branches and logs for a fire and started it with a lighter. The flames crackled and popped, giving off warmth and light as the sky darkened. I sat close, eating a simple dinner of canned beans and bread. Nothing fancy, but it was enough. As night fell fully, the woods grew darker and the sounds changed. The daytime chorus of birds was replaced by the hoot of an owl and the rustling of small critters in the underbrush. The wind picked up slightly, causing the branches to creak softly overhead. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the forest, I felt a strange sense of calm mixed with a hint of unease. There was something about being so far from everything familiar, surrounded by shadows and unknown sounds that kept my senses sharp. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. A sharp noise had broken the silence. A loud crack, like a heavy branch snapping somewhere nearby. My heart jumped, and I stayed still, trying to listen. The night was quiet again, but that crack felt close, too close. I told myself it was probably a falling branch or an animal moving through the undergrowth. But then, I noticed something odd. The wind had shifted, and now the air smelled different. Faintly metallic, almost like rust or something burning. I rubbed my eyes and listened harder. Another crack, louder this time, came from the east side of the clearing. It wasn't a small branch breaking. This sounded like something heavy stepping through the woods. My mind started racing. There shouldn't be anyone else around this late. The nearest campground was miles away. I reached slowly for my flashlight on the ground next to my bag. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees just beyond my tent. I scanned carefully but saw nothing, just shadows and shapes moving gently in the wind. I tried to calm my breathing. I told myself to relax, that the woods were full of animals and that's all it was. Deer, raccoons, maybe a stray dog. Nothing to worry about. But then the noises started again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching leaves and snapping twigs. It wasn't fast like a scared animal fleeing, but steady and heavy. The sound moved closer, circling around the clearing. I froze, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. I could hear it clearly now, the crunch of boots or shoes stepping through the dry leaves. I wasn't alone. For a moment, I considered packing up and running to the truck, but the path back was dark and I had no idea where exactly the sounds were coming from. I gripped my flashlight tighter and stood, keeping my eyes on the edge of the clearing. The footsteps stopped. Silence again. Then, faint but clear, a low sound started. A soft muttering or maybe a whispered curse. It was so faint I almost thought I imagined it. But it was real. I backed slowly toward my tent, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I grabbed my pocket knife from the tent floor, the only weapon I had. The whispering grew louder for a moment, then stopped abruptly. The silence was worse than the noise. I stood there, frozen, straining to hear. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, about my age, wearing a dark jacket and a cap pulled low over his face. He didn't speak. He just stared. I held the flashlight steady on him. His eyes reflected the beam back at me, cold and unreadable. I felt a wave of fear mixed with adrenaline. This wasn't just a random stranger. Something about the way he moved, slow and controlled, made me think he was watching me, waiting. I took a step back, still shining the light on him, trying to figure out what to do. The man turned and disappeared silently back into the woods. I didn't move for what felt like hours. Eventually, I forced myself to crawl back into my tent and zip it up tight. I lay there, listening to every sound, my mind racing. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I packed quickly, leaving most of my gear behind. I didn't look back. The trail back to my truck felt longer and more exposed. Every shadow and crack made me jump. When I finally reached my truck, I locked the doors and sat inside, shaking. I called the park ranger's office as soon as I got signal and reported what happened. A strange man lurking near my campsite in the middle of the night. The ranger told me they'd send someone to check, but warned me it might take some time. Apparently, the area had some reports of trespassers and a few minor thefts recently. I waited, keeping the truck locked and my phone close. After about an hour, a ranger showed up in a Jeep. He checked my campsite and the nearby woods carefully but didn't find the man. He advised me not to camp alone in that area again and to report any future sightings immediately. I left the park that day, feeling shaken but grateful to be safe. In the weeks that followed, I kept thinking about that night. No ghosts or monsters, just a real person with bad intentions. It was a reminder that the wilderness can be dangerous in ways you don't expect. Not from nature, but from people. I never went back to Maple Ridge, and I learned to respect the silence and shadows of the woods in a way I never had before. Camping isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's a test, a challenge to face your fears and stay alert, even when you want to believe you're alone. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I was 26 then, living in a small town in northern Oregon. The place I chose was a spot I had heard about from some local hikers, a stretch of forest along the Deschutes River, far enough from any road or town that it promised peace and quiet. I wanted to get away from everything, from work, from people, from the noise that clung to everyday life. Just me, the trees, and the river. I packed light but carefully. My old canvas backpack had room for a small tent, a sleeping bag, a few cans of food, a water bottle, a first aid kit, and a flashlight with spare batteries. I didn't want to be weighed down, so I left the heavier gear behind. I was confident. I had been on short hikes before, but nothing like this 3 days alone in the wild. The drive was quiet. The sky was a pale blue with wisps of clouds, and the air smelled fresh. I parked my car at the end of a rough gravel road and started walking down a narrow trail that wound through tall pines and firs. The forest was dense and smelled of damp earth and moss. Bird songs filled the air, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. Every step felt like I was leaving the world I knew behind. After about 2 hours of walking, I found a small clearing by the riverbank. The water was crystal clear, flowing steadily over smooth stones. It was the perfect spot to set up camp. I unpacked my gear and put up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to hear the river but far enough to be safe if the water rose overnight. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I spent the afternoon exploring the area, walking along the river to get a feel for the terrain. The forest was peaceful, but I noticed how quiet it was. No distant car engines, no planes overhead, just the sounds of nature. It was a kind of silence I wasn't used to. The trees were tall and thick, their branches weaving together to form a kind of green roof overhead. The ground was soft with pine needles and fallen leaves. As evening approached, the light softened, and the sky turned pink and orange. I gathered some dry wood and made a small fire in a stone ring I found near the clearing. The fire crackled and popped, and I cooked some canned beans over the flames. The heat was welcome after the coolness of the forest. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the taste of the food. It felt good to be alone, to be away from the constant buzz of the city. Night fell quickly in the forest. Stars appeared one by one, bright and sharp against the dark sky. The river's steady murmur was the only sound breaking the silence. I lay on my sleeping bag inside the tent, listening to the night noises. Crickets chirping, owls hooting in the distance, the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the woods. I felt calm but alert, aware of every small sound. I thought I would sleep well, but around midnight, something woke me. At first, I thought it was the river, but then I heard a different noise, a faint rustling, like footsteps moving carefully through the underbrush. My heart rate quickened. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer or some small animal, but the sound didn't match what I had heard before. It was heavier, slower, more deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, my breath shallow. The sound came closer, stopping just outside the tent. Then it moved away, fading back into the darkness. I didn't sleep after that. I kept my flashlight close, occasionally shining it out the tent's flap, but I didn't see anything. The forest seemed different at night, less friendly. Shadows shifted strangely in the flickering firelight, and every crack and rustle felt like it might be something watching me. The next morning, I woke early and packed up the fire pit carefully, making sure to put out the embers completely. I didn't want to leave any trace, but the previous night's tension was still there, making me nervous. I decided to explore more before heading back to my car. As I walked along the river, I noticed strange marks on the trees. Deep scratches, rough and jagged, some fresh-looking. I hadn't seen anything like that before. The bark was torn as if by claws or sharp tools. It was unsettling. The forest, which had seemed peaceful before, now felt like it was hiding something. I kept moving, trying to focus on the beauty around me. The sunlight filtering through the leaves, the wildflowers growing near the path, the smooth stones in the riverbed. But the scratches on the trees stayed in my mind. I made a mental note to check for any other signs. Around midday, I found something that made my stomach twist. On the ground near the water, partially covered by leaves, was an old, worn-out backpack. It looked like it had been there for a while. Faded fabric, torn in places and covered with dirt and moss. I hesitated before picking it up, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, I found some old cans, a half-empty water bottle, a flashlight with dead batteries, and a crumpled piece of paper. I unfolded the paper carefully and saw that it was a map, hand-drawn and marked with several points along the river and the surrounding forest. There were also some notes in messy handwriting, but they were mostly illegible except for one clear phrase: "Watch the marks. Don't trust the silence." Cold feelings settled over me. Who had left this backpack here? What did the notes mean? I looked around, but the forest was quiet again. The sun was high, and the warmth made the strange discovery feel even more real. I put the backpack down gently and decided to keep going, following the river a little further upstream. As I walked, I paid closer attention to the trees and the ground. The scratches I saw earlier became more frequent, some deep enough to suggest they weren't made by animals. They looked deliberate. Later that afternoon, I came to a narrow bend in the river where the forest grew thick and dark. The trail faded here, replaced by uneven ground and tangled roots. I noticed fresh footprints in the soft earth. Large, heavy steps that weren't mine or any animal I knew. They led deeper into the forest. My heart hammered, but I forced myself to follow the tracks. They went for about 100 yards before disappearing near a fallen tree covered in thick moss. I looked around carefully but saw nothing else. No people, no signs of a campsite or tools. I realized I wasn't alone in this forest. Someone had been here recently. Someone who left the marks on the trees. Someone who left the backpack. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows. I turned back toward my camp, my pace quickening with every step. I wanted to leave before dark, to get back to my car and the safety of the town. But as I walked back, the forest seemed to close in around me. The shadows grew longer, and every sound felt amplified. The crack of a branch, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. My senses were on high alert. When I reached the clearing where I had set up the tent, it was empty. My tent was gone. The fire pit was cold and disturbed, the stones scattered. It was as if someone had been there, taken everything, and left. Panic surged through me. I checked my backpack, which I had hidden under some bushes, and it was untouched. My food and supplies were safe, but my shelter was gone. I couldn't stay here without my tent. The forest night was cold and dangerous. I decided to make a new plan. I gathered some wood and started a small fire, sitting close to it for warmth. I stayed alert, shining my flashlight into the trees every few minutes. The rustling and snapping sounds continued around me, but nothing appeared. I thought about trying to find my way out immediately, but the sun had nearly set, and the forest was darkening fast. I knew I would be walking blind on the rough trail. Staying put seemed safer, at least until dawn. That night, sleep didn't come. The fire's glow was my only comfort. I kept hearing footsteps and whispers of movement in the woods. My mind played tricks on me, imagining figures watching from the shadows. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, I was still awake. The cold dawn made the forest look less threatening. I packed what I could, knowing I had to leave fast. I followed the river back, moving quickly but carefully. The trail was clearer now, and I recognized landmarks from my hike in. After an hour, I spotted my car parked at the gravel road's end. As I loaded my gear into the car, I looked back at the forest edge. The trees stood tall and quiet, the river flowing steadily. The scratches on the trees, the footprints, the missing tent. All of it didn't make sense, but it was real. Driving away, I realized that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but the unknown people who live unseen in the wilderness, watching and waiting. People who leave signs but never show themselves. I never returned to that spot. I don't know who else was out there or why they wanted me to leave, but I learned to respect the silence in the forest because sometimes it hides more than just nature. The memories stayed with me, a quiet warning. The wild isn't always empty, and some dangers don't come with a face or a story, only signs and signs. It was the summer of 2013 when I decided to take a break from my usual routine and head out on a solo camping trip. I was 27 at the time, living in a small town in northern Michigan. The idea was simple: spend a few days away from the city noise, no phones, no internet, just me and the woods. I had been camping before, but mostly with friends, so this time I wanted to test myself, see how I'd manage alone. I chose a spot deep inside the Hiawatha National Forest, about 2 hours from my house. The forest was known for its dense trees, large lakes, and the occasional wild animal. Not too far from the main road, but isolated enough that I could truly feel the wilderness. I packed my car the night before: a small tent, a sleeping bag rated for the summer nights, a compact stove, some canned food, a first aid kit, water, and my trusty old flashlight. I double-checked everything before leaving at dawn. The drive was peaceful, the roads winding through green hills and small towns that slowly disappeared as I got closer to the forest. When I reached the trailhead, I took a deep breath and felt the fresh pine air fill my lungs. The sun was just rising, casting a warm golden glow through the mist that hovered above the trees. I started hiking with my backpack, about 35 pounds heavy, carrying everything I needed for 3 days. The trail was narrow and rocky in places but well-marked. I kept my pace steady, my boots crunching on dry leaves and pine needles. The sounds of birds and the distant rustling of small animals accompanied me. After about 2 hours, I found a clearing near a small, calm lake, perfect for setting up camp. The clearing was surrounded by tall pines, their branches swaying gently in the light breeze. I picked a spot on the flat ground, not too close to the water, but close enough that I could see the lake's surface shimmer with the sunlight. The earth smelled rich and damp, and the air was cool despite the rising temperature. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the poles were secure and the rainfly was tight. After that, I collected some dry wood and built a small fire pit with rocks. By midday, I had a small fire going, just enough to boil water and warm some canned chili I had brought. I ate slowly, enjoying the silence except for the crackling flames and occasional bird calls. The lake was peaceful, the surface reflecting the sky like a mirror. I spent some time walking along the shore, dipping my fingers into the cool water. It felt good to be disconnected, away from the constant buzz of city life. As the day went on, I explored the nearby woods a little. I stayed on the marked trails, but sometimes stepped off to look at interesting plants or rocks. I found a patch of wild blueberries and picked a handful. The forest was alive with small sounds: squirrels scampering, the flutter of bird wings, leaves rustling in the wind. I returned to camp before sunset and started preparing dinner. The fire was easier to light now with dry wood and some kindling I had collected. The flames danced, casting long shadows around the clearing. I heated up some instant oatmeal for the next morning and wrapped myself in my sleeping bag once the fire died down. The stars were bright above, scattered across the dark sky like tiny lanterns. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke once to the sound of something moving just outside the tent. Maybe a raccoon or a deer, but I stayed calm, telling myself it was normal wildlife. I fell back asleep quickly. The second day was warmer and sunnier. I woke early, feeling rested. After breakfast, I decided to hike further into the forest, following a small creek that wound through the trees. The trail became rougher with fallen logs and loose rocks. I kept an eye on the path, aware that one wrong step could twist an ankle far from help. The creek was beautiful, clear water rushing over smooth stones, surrounded by ferns and moss-covered rocks. I followed it for a while, stopping to rest and drink water from my bottle. As the sun climbed higher, I noticed the forest grew quieter. The birds were fewer, and the usual rustling of small animals had stopped. I felt a little uneasy but told myself it was just the heat making everything slow down. When I turned back toward camp, I noticed something strange. The trail looked disturbed. Broken branches, footprints that didn't match mine. The footprints were bigger and deeper than mine, and they led both away from and toward my camp. I stopped and looked carefully. They weren't animal prints. They looked like human boot prints. My heart beat a little faster. I scanned the trees but saw no one. I wasn't close enough to the main road for hikers to be common, and I had heard that this part of the forest didn't get many visitors. I debated whether to follow the prints or just go back to camp, but curiosity pushed me forward. I followed the prints for about half a mile. They seemed fresh, the dirt still soft and moist. The trail led to a small abandoned cabin, half hidden by overgrown bushes and fallen trees. I had never heard of a cabin here before. It looked old and weathered, the wood rotting in places. The door was hanging off its hinges. The sight of the cabin made me feel uneasy. I took a few steps closer, scanning the area. There were no signs of recent human activity except for the footprints. The windows were broken, and inside I could see scattered debris, old furniture, rusted cans, and torn fabric. Something about the place didn't feel right. I felt exposed and vulnerable. I decided not to stay long and hurried back toward camp. That afternoon, I kept a closer eye on my surroundings. I double-checked my tent, making sure everything was secure. The forest was quiet again, the sun setting earlier behind the trees. I lit the fire, hoping its warmth and light would keep me safe. Late into the night, I heard noises. Not the usual small animal sounds, but something heavier, like footsteps or branches breaking. They seemed to be moving around my camp's edge, circling slowly. My heart pounded and I stayed perfectly still, listening. I considered packing up and leaving, but it was pitch dark, and I wasn't sure I could navigate the trail safely without daylight. The sounds stopped after a while, and I finally fell asleep, although it was a restless sleep filled with uneasy dreams. On the third day, I woke up before sunrise, still feeling tense. I packed my things quickly, doused the fire, and left no trace behind. I took a different route back toward the main road, sticking to the marked trails. As I walked, I saw broken branches and footprints again, but this time they seemed to follow me. The sense of being watched grew stronger. I increased my pace, trying not to panic. The forest seemed to close in around me. After about 2 hours, I finally reached my car, parked under the tall pines near the trailhead. I breathed a sigh of relief, locked the doors, and started the engine. Driving away, I glanced back at the forest, the trees standing still under the bright morning sun. I realized I had escaped whatever had been following me. It was a mix of relief and lingering fear that stayed with me for days. Back home, I checked online for any reports about the cabin or strange activity in the forest. There was nothing. No missing persons, no police reports, just silence. I never went back to that part of the forest. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark or driving through quiet roads, I think about those footsteps in the dirt, the broken cabin, and the feeling of being watched. I don't know who or what was out there, but I'm certain it wasn't friendly. And that knowledge stays with me, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts. They're real people, real threats hidden in the quiet wilderness. It was the summer of 2017, and I had just turned 33. I'd been working as an electrician in Tulsa for over 10 years, and life had become so routine that some days I didn't know what day of the week it was. I wasn't married, no kids, just a one-bedroom apartment, a few tools, and a rusty red pickup I barely maintained. Around early July, I realized I hadn't taken any real time off in almost 2 years. I was feeling tired, anxious for no reason, snapping at small things. That's when I decided to get away from everything for a while. I remembered this little state park I visited once when I was a teenager with my uncle, Eufaula Lake in Oklahoma. It was a little under 2 hours from my place. The lake was huge, with lots of remote campgrounds, hiking trails, and thick woods. I thought it'd be good to just disappear into the trees for a few days, away from traffic and noise and work orders. I planned it out as simply as possible. I packed up my old tent, a sleeping bag, 2 coolers full of food and drinks, my small propane stove, a hatchet, flashlight, batteries, and a few changes of clothes. I didn't take a phone charger because I wasn't planning to use my phone. I wanted real quiet. No texts, no scrolling, just the woods and me. I left on a Thursday morning, early enough to beat the heat and traffic. The drive down was smooth, no delays, and I reached the park office by 10. I asked for a primitive campsite, the kind without electricity or running water. The ranger gave me a map and circled a spot called Rock Bluff, about 3 miles off the paved road. He said most people didn't go that far in, but if I wanted peace and solitude, it was the best place. The dirt road to the site was rough, barely wide enough for my truck, and full of ruts. I went slow, windows down, letting the hot summer air pour in. Grass brushed the bottom of the truck, and tree branches smacked the sides. After about 30 minutes of bouncing along, I pulled up to a small clearing with a rusty metal fire ring and an old picnic table. It was perfect. Trees all around, no other vehicles in sight, no sounds except cicadas and birds. I set up my tent just off the clearing, in a small patch of even ground. I stacked some firewood, made sure my food was secured in a cooler, and then sat at the table and just listened. Felt like something I hadn't done in years.
No basing no te fekasgens.
No voices, just trees moving in the wind. The first day was great. I took a short hike down a nearby path that led to a part of the lake's shoreline. The water was low, and the bank was muddy and cracked, but I liked how quiet it was. I sat on a rock and watched the sky turn orange as the sun started to drop. I got back to camp just before dark, lit a small fire, cooked up some sausages in a pan, and ate by the firelight. That night was peaceful. I lay in my tent, listening to owls hoot and small animals moving in the underbrush. Took a while to fall asleep, but once I did, I slept deep. The next day, Friday, I woke up around 7. The tent was warm already, and the sun was pouring through the mesh windows. I made coffee on the propane stove and ate a couple of granola bars. I hiked again, this time taking the longer trail that looped through a section of pine forest and came back around to the campsite. I saw deer tracks, and once I thought I heard a wild hog, but I didn't get too close. I spent the rest of the day reading and dozing off under the shade. Around sunset, I made a fire again, cooked some canned chili, and sat watching the light fade. The air felt cooler, and for the first time in months, I felt like my mind had actually slowed down. I was thinking less and noticing more. Felt good. That night, though, was different. Couldn't sleep. I lay in the tent for hours, tossing and turning. I couldn't figure out why. It wasn't too hot. Nothing was biting me, but something felt off. It wasn't noise. In fact, it was the quiet that started to get to me. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I realized the woods had gone completely silent. No owls, no insects, nothing. I sat up in my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent just enough to poke my head out. It was dark, and the fire had long gone cold. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The stillness, like everything was holding its breath. I sat there for a long time, scanning the trees, straining my ears. Then I heard something, a soft thud, like a footstep. It wasn't far, maybe 30 feet away. Another step, then silence again. I froze. My heart was racing. I waited. No more sounds came. After 10 minutes, I closed the flap slowly and lay back down, but I didn't sleep. I lay awake until the light started to come back. When the birds finally started chirping again, I almost laughed out of relief. Saturday morning, I told myself it had just been a deer, maybe a raccoon. Animals move around at night, but I still felt weird about it. The hairs on my arms kept rising for no reason. I told myself I'd stay one more night, then pack up and leave early Sunday. I wasn't in the mood to hike again, so I just stayed at camp. I sharpened my hatchet, cleaned up the trash, and read. But I kept glancing at the woods, watching the line where the trees started. That evening, I didn't light a fire. I kept things quiet and ate some crackers and jerky cold. I figured if anything was out there, maybe the light was drawing it in. As the sun dropped, I made sure everything was packed up tight, and I kept my flashlight beside my sleeping bag. I lay there in the tent, waiting. It was the same as the night before. The usual sounds died out around midnight. I kept my eyes open this time. I didn't even try to sleep. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it again. A step, then another, this time closer. Something was walking slowly around the tent. Not circling, but pacing like it didn't want to get too close. I held my breath and didn't move. My hand gripped the flashlight tight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to show I was awake. After a few minutes, the footsteps faded, but the silence stayed. That was enough for me. As soon as the sun came up, I packed everything into the truck. I didn't eat, didn't take a last walk, didn't even fold the tent. Just stuffed it into the back. I drove down that narrow dirt road faster than I should have, bouncing over ruts and scraping branches. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. Back in town, I told myself again and again it was probably just a curious animal. Maybe even another camper hiking through. I didn't really believe that, but I needed to move on. I unloaded everything, shoved the camping gear into the closet, and went back to work on Monday like nothing happened. But about a week later, I got a call from the park office. They had found my cooler, not near the campsite, but about half a mile down one of the lesser-used trails. It was empty, but nothing was broken. They said they found it sitting under a tree, lid closed, like someone had just placed it there. That didn't make sense to me. I was sure I left it in the back of my truck when I packed up. I even remembered tossing it onto the passenger seat. I checked my apartment. It wasn't there. I didn't go back to get it. I told the ranger to toss it or keep it. I didn't want it anymore. I haven't gone camping since. The thing that gets to me the most is how deliberate it felt. Like something or someone knew I was there, watched me for a while, and then walked off with my stuff, not to steal it, but to let me know they could. That I wasn't alone out there. Not really. I don't think I'll ever get an answer. I've thought about putting up cameras or going back just to see. But every time I think about returning, I remember that silence. The way the air felt dead. The steps right outside the tent. And I decide to stay home. Sometimes peace and quiet isn't what you need. Sometimes it's a sign you're being watched. And if I learned anything from those nights in the woods, it's that when the forest goes silent, you should listen. Because something else is. I was 32 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in early October of 2021. I just quit a draining job in Milwaukee and wanted a break from everything. No emails, no people, no noise. My plan was to spend a few quiet days deep in the Nicolet National Forest in northern Wisconsin. It wasn't the most remote place on earth, but large parts of it were wild, and you could hike for hours without seeing anyone. I'd been there a few times with friends, but this was the first time I was going alone. I packed carefully. A solid tent, my thick sleeping bag, bear spray, a water filter, freeze-dried food, and a solar battery for emergencies. I had my old compass, a paper map of the area, and a GPS backup. I'd been on dozens of camping trips and considered myself experienced. I'd chosen a spot near a stream about 4 miles from the nearest road, off one of the lesser-used trails, and I planned to be out there for 3 nights. The drive up took about 4 hours. I parked in a small gravel lot where a trailhead branched into the deeper woods. I saw one other car when I got there, a dark green truck with Minnesota plates, but no sign of its owner. I checked my gear one last time, locked the car, and started hiking. The first couple hours were peaceful. The forest was quiet in that early autumn way. Some rustling leaves, a few birds, the crunch of boots on dirt. The trees had started turning, but there was still a good amount of green. I passed a shallow creek, climbed a ridge, and finally found a clearing near a bend in a narrow stream. It was a perfect spot. Level ground, close to water, hidden from the trail by thick underbrush. I pitched the tent, set out my gear, and made a small fire ring with stones. That first night was calm. I made dinner with my portable stove, watched the fire until it burned low, and crawled into my tent. I lay awake for a while, just listening. I could hear the stream trickling a few feet away and the occasional pop of a branch in the woods. I camped enough to not jump at every noise. After about an hour, I drifted off. I woke up early the next morning, chilled and stiff. The air had dropped into the low 40s overnight, and I had to boil water just to warm my hands. I made oatmeal and coffee, then took a short hike up the nearby ridge. From the top, I could see the forest stretching out for miles. Endless trees, a few flashes of orange and red in the canopy, and not a single roof or road. It was the kind of view that made you feel small in a good way. I spent most of the day reading and walking the area near my site. I didn't go too far. The terrain was a little rougher than I remembered, and I didn't want to twist an ankle alone out there. Around late afternoon, I noticed something that seemed a little odd. There was a single boot print, just one, in a patch of soft dirt about 50 yards from my tent. It looked fresh, not mine. I'd worn my hiking boots, and the tread was different. This one looked flatter, like a work boot or something similar. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the guy from the green truck had passed through and left it. Maybe someone had gone off trail. It wasn't unheard of. Still, something about it made me feel uneasy. Not afraid exactly, just alert. I looked around a bit more, but didn't see any other prints. No sign of a trail. I went back to camp, made dinner, and stayed close to the fire until night fell. That second night was louder. There were more cracking branches than the night before, and one time I thought I heard a soft thud, like something heavy dropping onto the forest floor. Could have been a deer, could have been nothing, but it kept me awake longer. I slept in short bursts, waking at every rustle. The next morning, I woke up to something that immediately put me on edge. My backpack had been moved. I always kept it zipped and under the rainfly, just outside the tent entrance. But now it was a few feet away, sitting halfway in the dirt, and one of the side pockets was unzipped. At first I thought maybe I hadn't secured it well, but I knew I had. I always checked it before going to sleep. Nothing was missing. My wallet, satellite phone, and gear were all still there. But the fact that it had been moved at all made my stomach tighten. An animal could have done it, sure, but the pocket wasn't torn or chewed. It was unzipped like a person would do. I stood there for a while, staring at the bag. I listened to the woods. It was quiet, too quiet. I didn't want to panic, but my gut was telling me something was off. I decided to pack up a few hours early and hike out the next day instead of staying the full 3 nights. I didn't want to leave in the dark, so I'd wait until morning. I spent the rest of the day double-checking everything. I kept my knife on me. I moved the tent closer to a thicket, half hidden by saplings and brush. I didn't make a fire that night. I ate a cold dinner in silence, listening. No music, no movement, just me in the woods, waiting for something I couldn't explain. That night was the worst. I lay in the dark, barely breathing, knife gripped in my sleeping bag. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Not a deer crashing through the brush, not a squirrel or a raccoon. Human footsteps, slow, heavy, careful. Leaves crunching softly, sticks snapping underfoot. They stopped maybe 15 feet from my tent. I could hear breathing, just outside the nylon wall. It wasn't mine. It was too deep, too slow. I stayed completely still. The footsteps didn't move for what felt like 10 minutes. Then I heard the soft sound of something being placed on the ground, like fabric brushing leaves. After that, nothing. Silence. I didn't sleep. I lay there, heart pounding, every nerve buzzing. I waited for the tent to unzip, for the blade to come through. But nothing happened. Eventually, I saw the sky lighten through the mesh ceiling. I waited until it was fully bright before I moved. When I finally stepped outside, the ground was disturbed. Not torn up, but scuffed. Someone had stood there, and sitting in the leaves was a small plastic bag, the kind you'd use for a sandwich. Inside was a folded piece of paper. I didn't want to touch it, but I had to know. I opened it with the edge of my knife. The note just said, "You should leave." That was it. No name, no threats, just a warning, or maybe a promise. I packed in less than 10 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't brush my teeth. I shoved everything into my bag, collapsed the tent without rolling it, and started hiking back toward the trailhead as fast as I could go. I kept checking over my shoulder. Every branch crack made me flinch. I didn't stop, didn't rest. I walked straight for 4 miles, my legs burning, sweat soaking through my shirt despite the cold. When I finally saw my car, it felt unreal, like I'd stepped out of a nightmare. The green truck was gone. The lot was empty. I didn't waste time. I threw my stuff in the back seat, locked the doors, and drove until I hit the main highway. I didn't stop until I got to a gas station in Crivets, about 30 miles away. Only then did I sit in the parking lot for a while, trying to breathe like a normal person. I never reported it. What could I say? There was no crime, no injury, no proof. Just a note and a feeling and a few scuffed leaves. But something happened out there. I still don't know what. I've told myself it could have been some strange loner, someone living off-grid who didn't want company. Maybe they just wanted to scare me off. If that's all it was, it worked. I haven't been camping alone since. I still go sometimes with friends close to home, where you can hear cars in the distance. But I don't go deep anymore. I don't trust the quiet the same way I used to. There's something about knowing that someone was standing a few feet from your tent in the dark, watching, waiting, breathing. That kind of thing changes you. And now, every time I step into the woods, even for a short hike, I always look for footprints first. I went camping by myself in the fall of 2017, a few miles outside of Helena, Montana. I was 27 at the time, working construction jobs off and on, and I had just finished a long project that had worn me out. I didn't have a girlfriend, no real family around, and not much else going on, so I decided to take a break. I packed my old Nissan pickup with some gear, tent, sleeping bag, propane stove, some canned food, water jugs, a knife, a basic first aid kit, a flashlight, and a couple of books, and headed out to a remote camping area I had been to once before with a buddy a few years earlier. The spot was about a 30-minute drive past the last cell tower and at least an hour's hike from the closest gravel road, tucked beside a narrow creek with some flat spots good for pitching a tent. The first time I went there, I remembered how quiet it was. Not just peaceful, silent.
No planes o overhead.
No distant highway noise. Just the sound of wind through the pine and aspen trees, the occasional creek gurgle, and the dull thump of a bird landing on a branch. Took me about 2 hours to hike in because I was hauling more than usual. I carried the heavy stuff in 2 trips, actually. I wasn't in any rush. The air was cool and dry, and the leaves had just started turning orange and red. The trail was mostly animal tracks after the first mile, so I followed what I could and pushed through the rest. By the time I had everything set up, the sun was low behind the ridge, and the cold had already started creeping in. I built a small fire and heated up some chili from a can, then sat with my back against a log and listened to the woods. It was exactly what I wanted. Quiet, no pressure, no one around. The first night passed without anything strange. I slept okay, although I woke up once around 3 a.m. to pee and noticed how dark it was. Not just nighttime dark, but completely black. Even the stars looked smothered. I stood out there for a minute listening. Nothing. No crickets, no owls, not even wind. It felt like being underwater. That kind of silence is hard to describe unless you've felt it. I went back to sleep with no issues. The next day, I explored upstream a bit and found an old game trail that curved around some boulders and led up to a ridge. I followed it for a while, marking the trees with scratches from my knife so I wouldn't lose the way back. I didn't see any other people or signs of camps.
No wrappers, no footprints, no stacked hawks.
Just old animal bones, maybe from a deer, and some piles of dry bear scat that didn't look fresh. That night, something felt different. After the sun went down, I had another fire going and was heating up more food. The wind had died down early, and the air felt too still. Normally you'd hear the occasional twig pop or the groan of a tree settling, but that night there was almost nothing, just the soft trickle of the creek. While I was eating, I thought I saw something across the water, just a shape, tall, maybe 6 feet or more, standing still between two trees. It was only there for a second before it blended back into the darkness. I figured it was my imagination or a tree trunk catching the firelight wrong. I stood up and moved closer to the edge of the creek but couldn't see anything. I didn't have any booze or weed with me, so I knew it wasn't from that. Still, I told myself it was nothing and went to bed early. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps near the tent. Not fast or frantic, just slow and deliberate, crunching through the dry leaves and pine needles. One step, then another, then a long pause. I laid there in my bag with my eyes open, holding my breath. My knife was within reach, but I didn't move yet. The footsteps stopped about 10 feet from the tent. I couldn't tell which direction they had come from. I listened for breathing, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. After about a minute, I unzipped the sleeping bag as quietly as I could and grabbed the knife. Still nothing. I stayed awake for a long time, maybe until dawn. Never heard the footsteps again. When it got light, I got out of the tent and looked around. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing out of place. If it had been an animal, it would have left tracks or scat. And it wasn't windy enough for a tree to drop something heavy. It had sounded like a person. I told myself it might have been a deer or elk, something big moving slow. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I should have left that morning, but I didn't. I was stubborn and still tired from the hike. I figured if someone was messing with me, they would have done more than just walk around. So I stayed. I didn't go far that day. Just walked a short distance to refill water from the creek and sharpened a few sticks into stakes in case I needed to use them. Not that they would have done much. I kept checking over my shoulder. Every sound felt too close. A branch cracked once, high up in a tree, and I jumped like a dog hearing fireworks. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't cook anything. I just sat in the dark, waiting. My flashlight was in my jacket pocket, knife in hand. Around 11 p.m., I heard movement again. This time it was coming from farther back behind the tent, closer to the ridge. Soft, deliberate footsteps again. I held still and listened. They stopped. Then I heard a sound like something being dragged, maybe a stick or a rope. It went on for 10 seconds, then silence. I stood up slowly and stepped out of the tent. I had the flashlight ready but didn't turn it on. The moon was out, casting just enough light to see shapes, not details. I moved toward the sound, staying low, listening hard. About 20 feet behind the tent, I found something that hadn't been there before. A piece of rope tied in a loose loop, laid carefully across the path leading back to the creek. It wasn't old rope either. It was clean and dry, like it had been cut recently. No dirt on it, no fraying. That was it. I packed everything I could into my backpack within 5 minutes. I didn't care about the leftover cans or the tent poles. I just grabbed what I needed and started hiking back the way I came, using my flashlight now. The woods felt different at night. The shadows moved when they shouldn't. Every noise, an owl hooting, a branch swaying, felt like something was just out of sight. I didn't stop. I kept moving. I followed the trail I'd marked earlier, checking each knife scratch on the trees like they were mile markers counting down to safety. About halfway down, maybe 2 miles in, I heard something crashing through the trees behind me. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a person trying to move fast but clumsily. Branches breaking, leaves being kicked up. I turned the flashlight off and ducked into the trees. I didn't want to risk being seen. I laid there for a long time, maybe 10 minutes. I didn't hear the crashing again. Just my own breath and the wind starting to pick up again. When I finally moved, I stayed low and quiet, staying off the main trail when I could. I made it to the truck just after sunrise. I tossed the backpack into the passenger seat, slammed the door, and didn't look back. I didn't sleep for the next 2 days. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those footsteps or saw that rope. I didn't call the cops. What would I even say? There wasn't a crime. There was no evidence. Just my gut telling me I'd been watched and maybe stalked by someone who knew that area better than I did. I haven't gone camping alone since. Now, whenever someone talks about getting off-grid or finding a quiet place to relax, I think about that third night in the woods. The sound of footsteps stopping just outside my tent. The rope placed so deliberately on the ground. The crashing in the trees behind me. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a ghost. It was a person. And I think if I had stayed one more night, they would have done more than just watch. I never figured out who it was or what they wanted. I didn't see them. I never went back. But I do know that I trusted my instincts, and that's probably what kept me alive. That's the part people don't talk about when they tell stories like these. There doesn't have to be a monster. It doesn't have to be a movie. Sometimes, something as simple as a footstep in the wrong place is enough to remind you how alone you really are and how quickly things can go bad. I got out. I'm okay, but I'll never go that deep into the woods again. It was late September of 2018, and I decided to take a solo camping trip up to the Black Ridge area in southern Oregon. I was 34 at the time and had been working long weeks in a Portland office doing software QA for a mid-sized tech firm. I needed to get out of the city and reset. I'd camped before, mostly with friends, but this was my first real solo trip. I chose Black Ridge because it was quiet, not too far from Medford in case I needed anything, and the Forest Service trails weren't overcrowded. It was also high enough to get crisp air, especially this time of year. The fall colors were just starting to come in, and the weather report said 3 days of clear skies, with lows in the 40s at night. I packed light but smart. A 2-person backpacking tent, a warm sleeping bag, a jet boil for hot meals, dehydrated food, water filtration gear, a compass, laminated maps, and enough layers to deal with the colder nights. I also had a flashlight, headlamp, backup batteries, a knife, bear spray, and a first aid kit. I left my GPS beacon behind because I wasn't planning on going more than 6 or 7 miles off the main logging roads, and cell coverage was spotty but not dead in the area. I parked off a forestry road at the trailhead and started hiking in around 10:30 a.m. on a Thursday. The weather was perfect. High 60s, sunny, and just the faintest wind stirring the pine trees. I saw no other cars at the lot, which made me feel good. I wasn't looking to be social. I wanted to hike, breathe clean air, and be alone with my thoughts for a couple of nights. The trail was well maintained. I hiked 5 miles in, stopping only to snack and drink water. I passed through a stretch of dense pine before reaching a more open plateau that looked west over a distant valley. I'd marked a small clearing near the base of a short ridge where a seasonal creek flowed in the spring. It was dry now but flat, with decent tree cover and enough space to pitch a tent well away from any game trails. No signs of animals other than some squirrel tracks and old deer scat nearby. I set up camp around 3 p.m., pitched my tent near the north edge of the clearing, and collected down branches to make a small fire later. After I unpacked and got things situated, I sat on a rock and just listened. The silence wasn't total. There were birds, a few insects, the sound of wind in the trees, but no man-made sounds at all. I didn't realize how much background noise city life had until it was gone. It was peaceful in a way I'd been craving. After a simple dinner of ramen and jerky, I settled in around 8:30 p.m. I didn't bother with a fire. The night came quickly in the woods. It dipped into the low 40s, but I stayed warm in the tent, reading for a bit with the headlamp before falling asleep. The first night went without any issues. I woke up a few times because the wind had picked up and branches tapped against each other, but nothing out of the ordinary. The next day, I did a long loop hike with a light pack, exploring more of the ridge and a higher overlook to the south. I found a small spring where I refilled my water with a filter and took photos of the sun breaking through the trees. I saw no other hikers, no boot prints on the trail, no litter. It felt like I had the whole area to myself. Back at camp that afternoon, I started a small fire just for the warmth and comfort of it, boiled water for another dehydrated meal, and ate while watching the light fade. I heard what I assumed was an elk bugling somewhere far off, but otherwise the forest was quiet. When it got dark, I put out the fire completely and tucked in. Again, the tent stayed warm, and I had no trouble sleeping. The third day is when things started to feel off. I woke up a little before dawn, maybe 5:45 a.m., needing to pee. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. It was cold, maybe high 30s, and there was light fog around the base of the trees. I walked a little away from the tent, did my business, and stood for a minute just watching the sky turn lighter. That's when I noticed something strange. Faint tracks in the dirt, just beyond the edge of my cleared area, heading toward the trees. They weren't mine. I had been careful about stepping in the same places, and there hadn't been any rain to soften or shift the ground. These were fresher. A single set boot prints, a size larger than mine. The pattern on the soles looked like a thick hiking tread, but not a brand I recognized. They came from the south, entered near the same dry creek bed I'd crossed 2 days before, then angled around my tent and disappeared back into the woods east of me. Not close enough to step on my gear, but close enough that someone had clearly walked through in the night or early morning while I was asleep. I stared at them for a while. My first thought was maybe I had missed another camper, someone doing a loop in the early hours, but the tracks made a tight arc, like they came to look at my site, then left without stopping. And I'd heard nothing. I'm a light sleeper when I'm out in the woods. A person stepping through dead leaves and pine needles within 50 feet of my tent should have woken me up. I walked the tracks as far as I could follow them, but they faded where the ground hardened near tree roots. There were no other signs, no trash, no broken branches, no markings. I checked around my camp. Nothing was moved or taken. Still, the feeling it left in me was sharp and cold. I debated leaving, packing up and heading back early, but I talked myself out of it. I'd brought a whistle, bear spray, a knife. Maybe it was just a hunter cutting through. Maybe someone who saw my campfire the night before and got curious. I didn't want to assume anything, but I stayed more alert that day. I skipped the long hike I had planned and stayed near camp, making a point to keep my pack ready and my spray nearby. By late afternoon, I'd mostly convinced myself it was nothing. I rebuilt my fire ring, gathered wood again, and made dinner. I still didn't hear or see anyone else. The forest was as quiet as ever. That night, I kept my headlamp within arm's reach and put a few stones near the tent door flap, just little pebbles that would shift if stepped on. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up. Not from a sound at first. It was like something jolted me awake. A pressure, maybe, or a sixth sense. My heart was already racing. I stayed still for a few seconds, listening. That's when I heard it soft, slow crunching outside. Leaves. Deliberate. Not wind. Not an animal. Something stepping slowly through the woods. Then a pause. Then 2 more steps, closer. I didn't move. My mouth was dry. I reached for the bear spray and held it tightly, barely breathing. The sound came again, now right at the edge of my camp area, just feet away from the tent. Then silence. No movement, just the kind of quiet that screams in your ears when you're afraid. I lay there for what felt like an hour. My arm went numb from staying still. Eventually, the night sounds returned. A distant owl, the wind picking up again. I didn't hear the steps again, but I didn't fall back asleep either. I waited until first light, then got out of the tent as soon as it was bright enough to see. The pebbles I'd placed by the door were scattered. One had been stepped on, flattened into the soft dirt, and there were more tracks, the same boot pattern. This time they led directly to my tent and stopped just a few feet from the entrance. No other tracks, no circling. Whoever it was had walked straight to the tent, stood there, and left the way they came. I packed everything in under 10 minutes. I skipped breakfast. I didn't even roll up the tent, just stuffed it into the top of the pack, still half unzipped. I hiked out fast, pushing harder than I'd normally go with a full pack. I didn't stop once, not for water, not to rest. I made it back to my car in just under 2.5 hours. As soon as I reached the gravel lot, I looked around. No other vehicles. No sign anyone had been there. I threw my gear in the back and drove until I got cell service again. I didn't call the cops. I didn't really have anything to report. No confrontation, no damage, nothing taken. Just footprints and the deep, undeniable sense that someone had been watching me, moving through the forest with purpose. I didn't camp alone again for over 2 years after that. When I finally did, it was in a park closer to town with other people nearby. I told myself I'd been unlucky, that it was just a drifter or hunter or someone passing through. But it didn't sit right. Not then, not now. Who walks that quietly through the woods at 2 in the morning? Who circles a lone tent, comes back a second night, and leaves without saying a word? I'll never know the answer, and maybe that's for the best. I was 31 when I took a solo camping trip deep into the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains, just north of Salmon, Idaho. It was late August 2019. I had been working nonstop for months. Long shifts at the sawmill and barely any time to breathe. So I told myself I needed a break. Not the kind where you lay around the house and still check your phone every few minutes. I wanted real space, real silence, the kind you only get far away from people. I'd grown up in Montana and spent plenty of time in the woods, so I wasn't worried. I planned to go off-grid for 5 days. Just me, my gear, and the trees. I packed everything carefully. A solid canvas tent, a thick sleeping bag, my stove, a bare canister for food, a fixed-blade knife, GPS, map, compass, matches, a basic med kit, and a small handgun I carried more for peace of mind than anything else. I even brought a book and a journal, figuring I'd have a lot of quiet hours. The plan was simple. Drive to the trailhead outside Gibbonsville, hike in about 12 miles along an old fire road, then cut off on a narrow, unofficial trail that led to a small alpine lake I'd seen on a topo map. I wasn't sure how many people knew about it. There weren't any mentions online or signs on the trail. That made it perfect. I parked my truck at the trailhead just after sunrise. It was a bright morning, sky completely clear, the kind of cold that makes your fingers ache when you touch metal. I slung my pack on, double-checked everything, then started the hike. The trail was a slow, steady climb through thick pine and fir, with soft patches of moss covering the rocks and logs. A few miles in, I passed an old hunting camp, just a pile of stones for a fire ring and a few weathered branches leaned into a crude shelter. No one had used it in years. By mid-afternoon, I reached the offshoot trail. It was more of a suggestion than a real path, just a slight break in the trees that headed northeast. I followed it, picking my steps over roots and loose soil. The trail narrowed the higher I got. The wind picked up, too. There were no tire tracks, no footprints, not even deer prints. That made me feel good. I was really out here alone. I reached the lake just before dusk. It was small, maybe the size of a football field, nestled in a rocky basin with tall trees all around. The water was so clear I could see the pebbles on the bottom from the shore. I picked a spot on the far side, away from the wind, and set up camp beside a wide flat rock. I made dinner, just freeze-dried chili, watched the light fade over the lake, and climbed into my tent early. I felt good. My shoulders ached, but my head was quiet for the first time in a long time. That first night, I barely slept. It wasn't fear or anything like that, just the usual adjustment to being out in the wild. Every creak of a branch, every gust of wind, every chipmunk sounded louder when I was alone. Still, nothing seemed off. When morning came, I boiled some water for coffee, stretched my legs, and took a slow walk around the lake. I didn't see any signs of wildlife bigger than birds. There were no fresh tracks, no scat, no fish jumping in the water. That was a little strange, but not too concerning. On the second night, things started to feel different. I'd gone to bed early again, with the sun already set, and was lying in my sleeping bag staring at the roof of the tent. I was starting to drift off when I heard something. Not loud, just a soft crunch, like a footstep on dry pine needles. Then another, very slow, very careful. I held my breath. The sound stopped. For a few seconds, I didn't move. Then I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a black bear passing through. I made some noise from inside the tent, unzipped my sleeping bag, shuffled around loudly. The sound didn't come back. Eventually, I fell asleep. By the third morning, I was unsettled. I hadn't seen or heard anyone in 3 days, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That afternoon, I went further from camp and explored up a ridge to get a better view of the surrounding forest. From up there, I could see the lake, my little orange tent, and nothing else. That made me feel better, at least for a while. But when I got back down to my camp, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. A few small rocks near the fire ring had been moved. I was sure of it. I'd made a circle out of them the first night to contain the flames. One of them was outside the ring now, and another had been turned over. I hadn't done that. I crouched down, looked around carefully. No footprints, no broken branches, no obvious signs. But it felt wrong. I went through my gear. Nothing was missing, nothing was touched that I could tell. The bare canister was sealed tight. Still, I kept my handgun on my belt the rest of the day. That night, I barely slept again. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard the same slow crunching. This time, it circled the tent. I stayed still, heart pounding. I didn't want to make a sound. Whatever it was moving very carefully, deliberately. Not fast, not stumbling. Not like an animal. I waited until the sound faded completely before I dared unzip the sleeping bag. I didn't go outside. At first light, I packed everything in a hurry. I was done. I didn't want to find out what or who was out there. I didn't even make breakfast. I shoved everything into my pack, took one last look around, and started down the trail. I moved fast, barely stopping to drink water. I kept checking behind me. After about 4 hours of hard hiking, I stopped to catch my breath. I was still a good 5 miles from my truck. That's when I saw the boot print. Not mine, this one was fresher. The dirt was still damp under it. The heel was deeper than the toe, like someone had been walking uphill, toward where I'd just come from. But I hadn't passed anyone, and it was a different tread than mine. I kept moving. The trees felt closer now. Every sound snapped my head around. At one point, I thought I heard movement behind me. Sticks cracking, but when I stopped to listen, everything went quiet. The sun started to dip behind the ridges as I neared the old hunting camp I'd passed on the way in. I told myself I'd just stop there to refill my water bottle from a nearby stream, then push on the last 2 miles to my truck. The camp looked the same. Same pile of stones, same old branches. But someone had been there. Recently, the ground was disturbed. A fresh scrape in the dirt like someone had dragged something heavy. There was a broken zip tie near the stones, half buried. I picked it up, then dropped it. My stomach tightened again. I didn't know why a zip tie felt so out of place, but it did. I pushed the last stretch hard. I made it to the trailhead as the light was almost gone. I could see my truck in the dirt lot. Relief washed over me like a wave. I tossed my pack in the bed, climbed inside, locked the doors, and just sat there for a few minutes catching my breath. Then I saw something in the mirror, just a flicker, movement at the edge of the woods. I stared, holding my breath. Nothing. I started the truck, turned on the lights, and scanned the trees. There was no one there, but the feeling didn't leave me. I drove straight out, tires spitting gravel, and didn't stop until I was back in Salmon. A few days later, back at home, I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe I'd imagined the boot print or exaggerated the sounds in the dark. But then I started looking into the area just out of curiosity. I found a few old articles online. One from 2004 about a missing hiker near Gibbonsville. Another from 2012, same area, different name. No bodies ever found. No suspects, just vanished. I haven't gone back since. I still camp sometimes, but never alone, and never that deep off trail. I keep thinking about those footsteps around the tent, that boot print facing uphill, and the zip tie in the dirt. I don't know what was out there with me. Maybe it was just some hunter or another hiker who kept their distance. But I've lived in these woods most of my life. I know what people sound like when they walk. I know what animals sound like when they move. That night, in the dark, I heard something that didn't belong. Something quiet, careful, watching. I left before I found out what it wanted, and I'm glad I did. I was 31 the summer I decided to take a long camping trip by myself. It was August 2022, and I had just finished a big project at work. I live in Spokane, Washington, and I had been planning for months to take a break from everything. No emails, no meetings, no people. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. I had taken solo hikes before, even spent a night or two out in the wild alone, but nothing as long as what I had planned this time. I wanted 5 full days out in the Colville National Forest. I knew the area pretty well from previous trips, and I had found a spot on the map, near a little-known trailhead called Dalton Ridge, that seemed like the perfect place to set up for a week. Isolated, scenic, and far enough off the main trails that I wouldn't be running into other hikers. I packed carefully. Tent, food for 6 days, water filters, a camp stove, 2 knives, extra batteries, bear spray, GPS unit, solar charger, everything. I checked and rechecked. My truck could get me within about 2 miles of the trailhead. From there, I'd hike in about 6 miles to a flat spot near a creek I'd seen on satellite images. I marked everything on both my GPS and a physical topographical map. My cell signal was going to be useless once I was a mile or 2 in, but I was ready for that. I left early in the morning, around 5:30 a.m. It took a little over 2 hours to drive out there, and the last 30 minutes were slow. Gravel roads, lots of ruts, narrow lanes where brush scraped against both sides of the truck. I parked under a cluster of tall pines and locked the doors, hiding anything valuable under the seats. There was no one around, no other cars, no sound besides the wind through the trees. Perfect. The hike in was beautiful. I followed a narrow game trail that barely showed on my map. I had to climb over a couple of fallen trees, and in one place I had to go around a muddy section where water had pooled from an earlier storm. But overall, it was just me and the sound of my boots on the forest floor, birds calling overhead, the occasional squirrel darting through the underbrush. By early afternoon, I reached the flat spot I had picked. The creek was maybe 100 feet from where I pitched my tent, flowing clear and cold. There was a mix of pine and fir trees, and enough space to set up camp without being right under any big branches that could fall if wind picked up. I unpacked everything, set up the tent, filtered some water, and made a late lunch. That night, I sat by the fire I built from dry branches and bark, watching the flames and feeling more relaxed than I had in months. The first day passed quietly. I took a short hike the next morning, following the creek for a couple miles downstream. I brought my GPS and marked my path carefully, always making sure I could get back easily. I didn't see anyone else. No other campsites, no rappers or signs of other hikers. It was like I had the forest all to myself. But the second night, something strange happened. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The forest was quiet. No wind, no animal sounds, just silence. Then I realized it wasn't completely silent. I could hear something very faint, like a stick breaking, maybe 30 or 40 feet from the tent. Then nothing. Then another soft crunch, like a footstep. I stayed completely still. I had seen deer on past trips, even the occasional elk. But this didn't sound like that. It wasn't fast movement. It was slow, deliberate. Step, pause, step. I didn't have a gun with me, but I had bear spray within arm's reach. I kept my hand on it and just waited. Whatever it was, it stayed out there for a while, 10, maybe 15 minutes, just moving slowly in the dark. Eventually, the sounds stopped. I didn't hear anything else the rest of the night. I stayed awake until the first light came through the trees. In the morning, I walked around the camp area, checking for tracks or anything disturbed. I found a spot where the pine needles were brushed aside, like someone had walked through. Human-shaped prints. Not boots, though, just bare feet. The toes and heels were clear in the dirt. That made no sense. I was over 6 miles from the road. No one else was camped out here. Who the hell walks barefoot through a forest in the middle of the night? I kept calm. Told myself maybe it was someone who'd gotten lost. Maybe they had taken off their shoes at some point. It was weird, but not impossible. I cleaned up the camp, made breakfast, and tried not to dwell on it. But I started to feel it, that creeping sense of being watched. The way your skin tightens on the back of your neck. I'd never had that out in the woods before. I've always felt safe out there. But now every sound made me freeze. That evening, I decided not to light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate cold food from my pack and sat inside the tent as it got dark. I left the rainfly rolled up so I could see out through the mesh. The forest faded into black as the sun dropped behind the ridge. I stayed awake a long time, listening. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again. Steps, closer this time, crunching softly through the pine needles. I stayed low, barely breathing. The sounds stopped near the edge of my campsite. I waited, holding the bear spray, trying to keep my breathing quiet. Then I saw it. Just a shape hard to make out in the dark, but it was human, standing maybe 20 feet from the tent. No flashlight, no gear, just standing there. I could barely see the outline of a head and shoulders against the trees. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I thought about yelling, but something told me not to. It didn't make sense. If someone was lost, they'd call out. They'd carry a light. They'd approach the tent. This person didn't. They just stood there, silent. After maybe 2 minutes, they turned and walked away. Not fast, just turned and disappeared into the trees. I stayed up until dawn again. That morning, I packed everything. I didn't want to wait and see if they came back. I hadn't seen another person since I left the truck, and I hadn't seen any sign of hikers. No boot prints, no gear, nothing. I loaded up my pack and started hiking out. Fast. I checked over my shoulder often. Every sound in the trees made my stomach tighten. But the weirdest part came about 2 miles into the hike back, when I reached a bend in the trail and saw a dead rabbit hanging from a tree branch. It had been tied there with what looked like a shoelace. Neck broken, fresh, maybe just a few hours old. Flies buzzed around it. That wasn't an animal kill. That was placed there. I moved faster. I kept the bear spray in my hand the entire way. I skipped food and just kept going, heart pounding in my ears. When I reached the spot where I'd parked, I found the truck exactly as I left it. But right beside the driver's side door, in the dirt, was another bear footprint. Deep in the dust. Human. No shoe. I unlocked the truck, tossed everything in the back seat, and drove out of there without stopping. I didn't even check my mirrors until I hit pavement again, nearly an hour later. When I got home, I filed a report with the Forest Service. I didn't expect them to find anyone. I just wanted it on record. I told them exactly what I saw. They said they'd check it out. Maybe they did. I don't know. What I do know is I've never camped alone since. I still go out, but only with friends now. I double-check every site. I don't go off-trail anymore. I don't stay anywhere I can't hike out of quickly. And I always carry more than just bear spray. I think about that shape in the dark. The bare feet. The way they never said anything. Never came closer. Just watched. I think that's what stuck with me the most. Whoever it was, they didn't want anything. They weren't trying to rob me or scare me. It was like they were just there. Like they'd been there a long time, and I had wandered into their space. They didn't care if I saw them. They just didn't want me to stay. I got the message, and I haven't gone back to Dalton Ridge since. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as I walked deeper into the forest, my boots crunching on the gravel path beneath me. I had never been to this part of the woods before. A small cabin stood nestled between towering trees, its wooden frame barely visible through the thick undergrowth. The year was 2023, and at 27 years old, I was far from inexperienced when it came to outdoor adventures. I had grown up camping and hiking, spending countless nights in tents and under the stars. But this cabin, perched on a remote hillside, seemed different. Something about it tugged at the back of my mind, though I couldn't place it. The plan was simple. I needed a weekend to escape, a weekend away from the constant noise of my daily life. Work, city traffic, social obligations, all of it. When I stumbled upon this cabin on an old camping website, I figured it would be perfect. A cozy little retreat in the middle of nowhere, far from any distractions. The owner had listed it as a rustic escape, something out of the ordinary, but the reviews were good, and I was all for a bit of quiet solitude. The cabin came into view as I rounded a bend in the path. It was smaller than I had expected, but charming. The wooden walls were weathered, the roof slanted steeply down to the sides, and the chimney poked out like a crooked finger against the gray sky. There were no other buildings in sight, no sign of other people for miles, just the deep forest surrounding it. I stepped up onto the porch, the wooden planks creaking under my weight, and turned the rusty doorknob. The cabin smelled of pine, old wood, and dust. It was as though it had been waiting for someone to come. A small wooden table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the room, a faded rug beneath it. The kitchen was to the right, with a cast iron stove and an old-fashioned sink. There was a tiny wood-burning stove in the corner, with a stack of firewood next to it. The furnishings were simple, nothing extravagant, but it felt homey in a way. I set my backpack down on one of the chairs and made my way to the window. From here, the view was spectacular. The forest stretched out for miles, and beyond that, jagged mountains rose, their peaks shrouded in mist. It was perfect, the kind of place I had been craving. I felt a sense of peace wash over me, the weight of the world lifting off my shoulders. I set about unpacking, organizing my things, making sure everything was in its place. I planned to stay here for 2 nights. I didn't intend to do much, just read, relax, and maybe do a little bit of hiking around the area. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned orange, I decided to take a walk around the cabin. The forest felt alive with the sounds of evening creatures, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, the occasional snap of a twig. But there was something else, a distant noise. It was faint at first, almost inaudible, but it was there. A low thudding sound, like something heavy hitting the ground. I stopped in my tracks, listening intently. The sound came again, and this time it was closer. I shook it off as a deer or some other forest animal, but the feeling of unease lingered. I had been in forests like this before, but never one so isolated. It was unsettling, in a way I couldn't fully explain. The cabin felt so distant from everything, like it was forgotten by the world, tucked away in the farthest reaches of the woods. I decided it was best to head back inside, where it felt safer. The moment I stepped back onto the porch, I heard the noise again. A sharp thud, then silence. It was coming from the woods, somewhere off to the left, just beyond the trees. I couldn't see anything, but I didn't want to go investigating, not when the forest was so thick and the darkness was creeping in. Inside the cabin, I stoked the fire, the warmth from the crackling logs filling the room. I made a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the night settle in. The silence outside seemed to grow deeper, and that's when I noticed it. The wind had stopped. No rustling leaves, no creaking branches, just a stillness that felt almost unnatural. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. That night, I slept fitfully. The bed was comfortable enough, but every creak of the house, every snap of wood in the fire, kept me awake. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate steps that moved around the cabin. My heart raced, but when I peeked out the window, I saw nothing but darkness and the outline of trees. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I woke early and made breakfast, determined to enjoy my time here. I headed out for a hike up the nearby hill, eager to explore the area. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, the trees tall and imposing, their trunks covered in moss. The sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled light on the ground. I tried to focus on the beauty of it all, but the sense of being watched lingered, just at the edge of my awareness. It wasn't until I reached the top of the hill that I found it. An old, rusted hunting stand, its metal frame half hidden by overgrown vines and branches. I approached cautiously, peering up through the gaps in the trees. It looked ancient, as if no one had used it in years. The wood was rotting, the metal oxidized. But what caught my eye was something unexpected. A small pile of what appeared to be animal bones scattered near the base of the stand. I crouched down to examine them. The bones were bleached white, old and brittle, as though they had been there for a long time. There was no sign of any recent animal remains, just these bones, lying in the dirt. A chill ran down my spine. Why would someone leave bones here, in the middle of the woods, far from any other human presence? My mind began to race, but I forced myself to leave the hunting stand behind and head back to the cabin. The afternoon passed without incident, and I began to feel a sense of calm returning to my body. I made dinner, read for a while, and then went to bed. But once again, sleep eluded me. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence of the cabin. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees, and I thought I heard something scratching at the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. It was just after midnight when I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening. The noise came from outside, a heavy thud against the cabin wall. I grabbed the flashlight from the table beside the bed and crept toward the window. I could see nothing in the darkness beyond the glass, but I heard it again. Thud, thud, thud. My pulse raced. I had no idea what it was, but it was definitely coming from the direction of the woods, just beyond the porch. For a moment, I considered packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to overreact. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. Maybe a bear or something large hitting the cabin out of curiosity. But there was an instinct inside me telling me to stay quiet, to stay still. I sat up, listening. The thudding continued for what felt like an eternity, then suddenly stopped. Complete silence returned, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But that wasn't the end of it. A new sound filled the air, footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching over the gravel path. They stopped at the porch and I held my breath, my hands trembling. Whoever or whatever was out there was close now. I could hear them shifting, moving, and then a soft knocking sound on the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I was paralyzed with fear. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The porch was quiet again, and the air felt thick with tension. I waited for what seemed like hours, but nothing happened. I had no idea if whoever had been out there was still around. I couldn't even bring myself to check the door. The thought of opening it and finding something out there in the dark made my blood run cold. By morning, I was exhausted. My nerves were frayed, my sleep disturbed by the events of the night. I knew I couldn't stay any longer, not after what had happened. I packed my things quickly, making sure I didn't forget anything. As I walked out the door and down the porch steps, I glanced at the woods one last time. The silence was back, but it was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It felt ominous, like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't look back as I left the cabin behind, walking quickly down the path that would take me back to my car. The drive home felt longer than it had any right to be, the road stretching out in front of me as if I were being pulled away from something I couldn't fully understand. As I turned the corner and the cabin disappeared from view, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly escaped something. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I'd never go back there. And for the first time in a long while, I was glad to be home. I took the trip in late September of 2022. The summer crowds had already thinned out, and the weather was starting to cool down in the hills around northern Idaho. I was 31, single, and had just finished a long-term project at work that burned me out completely. I had no desire to be around people for a while, no interest in going out drinking or talking to anyone about how stressed I was. I just wanted quiet, real thick silence. I wanted to feel the world without all the noise we wrap around ourselves every day. I packed up my black Tacoma with all the gear I'd need: tent, food, stove, water filter, first aid kit, knife, bear spray, clothes, boots, fire starter, backup everything. I made a list and checked it twice because I didn't want to end up halfway up a mountain and realize I'd forgotten something basic like matches. I wasn't new to this kind of trip. I'd done a lot of solo hiking and camping in my 20s, mostly in the Colorado backcountry. But this would be the longest solo trip I'd taken in a while. For nights, 5 days, no reception, no people, just me and the woods. I picked a spot in the Panhandle National Forest, up near the Montana border. It wasn't a well-known trail. I found it on a forum where a guy mentioned it in a comment from a few years back. He said the lake up there was cold and clear, and he'd seen nobody for 3 full days. That was all I needed to hear. I parked on a dirt turnoff about 30 miles east of Sandpoint, checked the lock on my truck, and slung my pack over my shoulders. It was heavier than I remembered from past trips, but I figured I'd adjust after the first mile or two. The first few hours of hiking were smooth, steep at times, but manageable. The trail twisted through dense pine, with patches of birch that rattled their dry leaves when the wind picked up. There was that sharp, clean smell of pine needles and cold dirt, and every now and then I'd catch sight of deer trails or scat. I saw a pile of moose droppings that looked fresh, but I didn't spot any actual animals. I made it to the lake by late afternoon. It sat low in a shallow bowl of rock, half ringed by steep cliffs and thick forest. The water was glassy, dark green, with no sign of algae or trash or even footprints near the shore. I set up my tent on a flat stretch about 30 yards from the lake, near a small outcrop that could break some of the wind. I cleared the ground of pine cones and sticks and got the tent staked in tight. Then I got a fire going. Not a big one, just enough to cook and keep warm when the sun dipped. That first night was peaceful. The temperature dropped fast after sunset, and the sky went from orange to deep blue and then black. I watched the stars come out, ate freeze-dried beef stew from a metal pot, and sat by the fire until I couldn't keep my eyes open. I crawled into the tent, zipped up the sleeping bag, and fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the trees. The next day I spent exploring. I followed a game trail that led up the ridge to the north, climbing until I could see the whole lake from above. It looked even more remote from up there. No tire tracks, no old campsites, no litter, just wilderness. I took a few pictures with my phone, even though I knew I wouldn't be able to send them until I got back. I came back down by early evening and filtered some water from the lake to refill my bottles. The water was cold enough to sting my fingers. That night, something felt off. Not wrong, not dangerous, just off. It started when I was eating. I just finished a packet of chili mac when I heard something move in the trees behind me. Not the wind, not a squirrel. A solid, deliberate snap. A heavy footstep. I stayed completely still and listened. Nothing followed. I waited another 5 minutes, thinking maybe it was a deer that caught my scent. I slowly got up, grabbed my flashlight, and scanned the woods. I didn't see anything. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up thinking I'd heard something. Twigs snapping, movement outside. But each time I unzipped the sleeping bag and sat up to listen, there was only silence. Thick, suffocating silence. The kind that gets inside your ears and makes you feel like you're hearing your own heartbeat. The third day was colder. I stayed close to camp, mostly chopping firewood from a deadfall I'd found and reinforcing the small fire pit with more rocks. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed something strange near the shoreline. On the rocks, about 20 feet from the water, was a long, thin strip of dark fabric. At first, I thought it was mine. Maybe something fell out of my pack, but when I picked it up, it wasn't mine. It looked like a sleeve torn from a jacket, black nylon with a Velcro strap and part of a zipper. It was dirty, but not decayed, not weather-worn. I stared at it for a while, trying to figure out how it got there. I walked the shoreline in both directions. No other signs of gear. No prints, no wrappers, no tools, no other clothes. Just that one sleeve. I took it back to camp and set it near the fire ring. I didn't want to keep it in the tent. That night was worse than the one before. I was nearly asleep when I heard something heavy walk through the brush. Closer this time. Definitely bipedal. I sat up fast and grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the sound. But again, there was nothing. No eye shine, no movement, just silence after the footsteps stopped. I stayed up most of that night, sitting near the fire with the bear spray in my lap. Every 10 minutes I scanned the woods, shining the light into the trees, checking behind the rocks. I kept the fire going until sunrise. The next morning I made the decision to pack up. I didn't feel right staying another night. I didn't feel scared exactly, just on edge, like something wasn't adding up. I packed quickly and hiked out with more urgency than I had on the way in. I made it back to the truck in the early afternoon, locked the doors behind me, and drove out fast. I didn't tell anyone about the sleeve or the noises, or the way I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me for at least 2 nights. I told myself it could have been a hunter, poacher, someone who didn't want to be seen. But there had been no tire tracks near the trailhead, no other camps, no scent of smoke, nothing. A week after I got home, I kept thinking about it. I couldn't shake the image of that jacket sleeve lying on the rocks. I ended up calling the local ranger station. I told them where I'd camped and what I found, and I asked if anyone else had gone missing up there. The guy on the phone paused a second too long before saying no, nothing recent. He thanked me for the report and said they'd send someone to check it out. A few weeks later, I got curious and searched for missing persons cases in northern Idaho. I didn't expect to find anything, but one result made my stomach flip. A hiker named Derek Callahan had gone missing in September 2021, almost exactly a year before I went. His truck had been found parked near a small trailhead east of Sandpoint. He told his brother he was heading to a remote lake in the forest and planned to be out for 3 nights. They never found him. They searched the area for weeks, but no trace turned up. No gear, no camp, no body. The picture they used in the article showed Derek wearing a black nylon jacket. The same kind of jacket the sleeve had come from. I sat there staring at that photo, the hair on my arms standing up. I couldn't breathe for a few seconds. I felt cold. It wasn't just nerves. It was a deep, twisting fear that settled right in my chest. That place, those woods, that lake was where he disappeared, and I had camped in the same exact spot. I must have been only a few yards from where he'd set up. Maybe I was right on top of where he'd vanished. I didn't call the ranger station again. I didn't tell anyone else what I found. I didn't want to deal with the follow-up, the questions, the possibility that I'd brushed right up against something I shouldn't have. I haven't gone camping since. I still go on hikes, but only during the day and only on marked trails with cell reception. No more solo trips. No more remote spots. I gave away most of my gear a few months after I got back. Not because I was scared I'd see something again, but because I knew that if I did, if I ever heard those footsteps again out in the trees, I might not get the chance to leave next time. Whatever happened to Derek, it happened quietly, without a scream, without a sign. Just one man alone in the woods who never came back. I was lucky. I know that now, and I'm not interested in pushing my luck a second time. I had been working from home for over 2 years straight, staring at screens day and night. My head felt heavy all the time, and I was tired of the noise from traffic outside my apartment in the city. One night, after another long shift, I finally decided I needed a real break. No screens, no emails, just a place where I could breathe again. I started searching for isolated cabins online, and after scrolling for hours, I found one deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It wasn't part of any resort or managed campground, just an old wooden cabin sitting by itself on private land, owned by an old man who barely used it anymore. The photos looked rough but livable, and that's exactly what I wanted. Somewhere quiet and real. I packed my car with enough supplies for a full week. Non-perishable food, water jugs, a first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, a portable stove, clothes, boots, and a few basic tools in case anything broke. I also brought my sleeping bag and a thick wool blanket. The cabin had no electricity, no cell service, and no running water. That made it perfect. The drive took about 8 hours from the city. The last 30 miles were rough, dirt roads full of potholes, tall trees on either side, and no sign of another human anywhere. The GPS cut out about 20 minutes before I reached the cabin. I had to rely on printed directions I'd written down before I left. When I finally arrived, it was late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip behind the tree line, and the air had that crisp bite that told me night was coming fast. The cabin looked like something from another time. The wood was dark from years of weather, the roof slightly sagging on one side. There was a small porch with 2 broken chairs and a crate that looked like it had been used as a table. I stepped inside and was hit with the musty smell of wood, dust, and something a little sour, maybe from a mouse that had died somewhere inside. The single room was small but enough. There was an old iron stove in the corner, a wooden table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a bed frame with a thin, sagging mattress. I opened the windows to air it out and started unpacking. The first night was calm. I boiled water on my portable stove, made some instant noodles, and sat outside in the growing darkness. I hadn't heard another voice in hours, just the occasional rustle of wind through trees or the sound of something moving in the underbrush, probably deer or raccoons. I felt peaceful. That night, I slept in my sleeping bag on top of the mattress. I kept the flashlight by my side, more out of habit than fear. The next few days followed a quiet rhythm. I would wake up early, cook something simple, go on long hikes through the forest, and return before dark. I had no connection to the outside world, and it felt like I was slowly peeling off layers of noise from my mind. My thoughts became clearer. I wasn't thinking about work or emails anymore. Just the sound of my boots on leaves, the way the trees creaked, and the sharp smell of pine. But around the fourth day, something started to feel strange. It was small at first. I noticed some of my food containers had been moved. Not opened, just shifted slightly. I thought maybe I had done it without noticing, but I always put things back in the same spot. Then I found muddy prints near the back of the cabin. Too large for a dog, definitely not a deer. They were boot prints and they were fresh. I hadn't seen a single soul since I arrived. No cars, no hikers, no voices. I tried to shake it off, telling myself maybe they were old and I just hadn't noticed them earlier. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, hearing noises outside, sticks snapping, leaves crunching. I stayed still, holding my breath. Every time I turned on the flashlight and looked out the window, I saw nothing. Just black trees. I told myself again it was probably just animals, maybe a bear. But bears didn't wear boots. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. I saw more boot prints, this time circling the backside. Some prints were deep, like someone had stood still for a long time. I checked all the doors and windows again. Everything was shut tight, but I couldn't stop thinking about how far I was from anyone. If someone was out here watching me, they could do whatever they wanted, and no one would know for days, maybe weeks. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed most of my things that day, keeping only what I needed for the night. I'd leave first thing in the morning, but just as the sun was going down, I heard something loud in the woods behind the cabin. Not just a branch breaking, this was different. A crashing sound, followed by silence. I stood frozen in the middle of the room. Then I heard it again, closer this time. It sounded like someone was running through the forest. I turned off the lantern, grabbed my flashlight and knife, and crouched near the window. I aimed the flashlight out the back window and clicked it on. Nothing but trees. I waited, heart thudding so hard I thought it might echo off the walls. Then something moved, just for a second. A flicker of movement behind a tree, far out in the darkness. I kept the light steady, but whatever it was didn't move again. I stayed there for hours, barely blinking. Around midnight, the sound stopped. I locked the door, blocked it with the table, and sat in the corner, knife in hand, waiting for morning. At first light, I threw everything in my car and started driving. I didn't care about the speed. I just wanted to get away from the cabin. But about 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. On the dirt road behind me, I saw a figure standing perfectly still. A man, dressed in dark clothes, maybe wearing a hood. He wasn't walking, just standing there watching. I didn't stop to get a better look. I kept driving until I hit the main road, then kept going another 3 hours before I even considered stopping. When I finally got home, I didn't unpack for days. I left the bags in the corner of the room and just sat in silence. I thought about that figure in the woods, those boot prints, the noises at night. Someone had been watching me the whole time. They never approached directly. They just watched, waited. Maybe they were waiting for me to slip up. Maybe they just liked to scare people. I'll never know. I looked up the cabin again a few weeks later. The listing was gone. I tried contacting the man who owned it, but there was no reply. Eventually, I stopped looking, but I never forgot the way it felt to know I was being watched. The silence of the forest that wasn't really silent. The footprints that weren't mine. The figure in the mirror that didn't move. Now, when people tell me they want to get away from everything, to find peace in the middle of nowhere, I don't say much. But I always think about that cabin. How peace isn't always peaceful. How quiet isn't always safe. I still go hiking sometimes, but I never go alone, and I never go too far off the map. I didn't plan the trip for anything special. I just needed a break. Everything back home had started to feel like noise. My job was the kind that crept into your head even when you weren't at your desk. And I had this constant twitchy need to check my phone. Like if I didn't reply to an email fast enough, the world might fall apart. So I picked a week in October, when the air would be cool but not freezing yet, and drove 5 hours north into Vermont. The plan was simple. Stay 3 nights in the forest near Groton, off one of those smaller trail loops that break away from the bigger campsites. I found it months ago on a hiking blog. The author said that if you walked 1.5 miles past the last designated fire ring, there was a little clearing next to a shallow stream, and barely anyone went that far in. That sounded perfect to me. I got to the trailhead around noon on a Wednesday. The lot was empty except for a white Subaru with a dusty back windshield. I took my pack from the trunk, locked my car, and started walking. It had rained earlier in the week, so the path was damp but not muddy. The leaves were turning all kinds of red and orange, and every now and then, one would flutter down in front of me like it wanted me to notice how pretty it was before it hit the dirt. I passed 2 fire rings along the trail, but kept going until the path started to narrow and the trees grew tighter around me. A fallen log marked the side trail I was looking for, just like the blog said. I turned off and followed a faint footpath down toward the stream. There was no one around, no tire tracks, no voices in the distance, just the sounds of water running somewhere ahead and the crunch of leaves under my boots. The clearing was still there. It had a dip in the middle where the ground was packed down, like others had set up tents before. I dropped my pack and stood still for a while. The air smelled like pine and wet bark. A squirrel ran across a low branch to my right, and birds hopped between trees. It was peaceful in that way you can only get when you're far enough from other people that the air itself feels different. I spent the rest of the afternoon setting up camp. My tent went in the dip in the clearing, and I gathered a circle of stones for a small fire pit. I'd brought enough water to last the 3 days, but I still walked down to the stream just to look at it. It was about 2 feet wide and shallow enough that I could see the smooth pebbles on the bottom. The water ran clear, and the bank on the other side was thick with undergrowth and ferns. That night, I lit a small fire and ate one of those vacuum-packed pasta meals I heated over the flame. The stars came out one by one, and I watched them for a long time. I could still hear the stream trickling below, and every now and then, a rustle from the trees when something small moved in the underbrush. Nothing unusual, just the normal sounds of the woods. I didn't fall asleep right away. It always took me a while on the first night of camping. I kept thinking I heard something just beyond the edge of the clearing, but I reminded myself it was probably just deer or raccoons. It wasn't like there were any predators around here. Sometime after midnight, I finally drifted off. When I woke up, it was from a dream I couldn't remember, but I was sweating despite the cold. I unzipped my sleeping bag a little and turned over, trying to go back to sleep, but then I heard it. Not the rustling again, not the breeze. It was the sound of something heavy snapping a branch. I lay still. I didn't move. I strained to listen. I know animals make noise in the woods all the time, but this didn't sound like a rabbit or a fox. It sounded slow and deliberate, like whatever it was didn't care how much noise it made. The sound moved around the perimeter of the clearing, behind my tent. A crunch of leaves, then another, then nothing. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sky finally started to lighten, I crawled out of the tent, heart still thudding. There were no tracks. Nothing looked disturbed. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, or maybe I dreamed the whole thing. I shook it off and went about my morning. I made coffee on my camp stove and sat by the stream. But the quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt tense, like the woods were holding their breath. That day, I hiked a loop trail about 3 miles long that circled the ridge near the clearing. I brought a day pack with snacks and a map, and I kept to the trail. It helped to walk. I didn't feel as nervous when I was moving. The forest was empty the whole way. I didn't see another person. No signs of anyone else. When I got back to camp, I checked everything. My tent was untouched. My food bag, which I'd tied up in a tree, was still there. But I kept noticing little things. A rock near my fire pit looked moved. My folding chair had shifted a bit, like maybe it had been knocked or brushed past. They were small details, and I told myself they didn't mean anything. That night, I skipped the fire. I ate inside the tent, trying not to make noise. I kept my flashlight close and didn't unzip the flap. The forest outside felt alive in a different way now. Every creak or crack made me jump. Then, sometime after midnight again, I heard it. A sound like breathing. It wasn't loud. It was faint, almost like wind moving through a tunnel. But it was rhythmic. Inhale, pause, exhale. I held my own breath to make sure it wasn't just me. The sound was right outside the tent. Then I heard another snap. Closer this time. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I had a bear spray canister in my hand, but my fingers were shaking so badly I wasn't sure I could use it right. I lay there, eyes wide, staring into the dark. And then, like the night before, silence. No footsteps, no breathing, just nothing. When the sun came up, I burst out of the tent. Again, no tracks, no signs. I walked in a wide circle around the clearing, checking for anything out of place. Nothing, but I knew what I heard. That was my second night. I still had one left. I didn't want to pack up early. I told myself if I left now, I'd never come back to the woods again. That fear would win. So I stayed. I forced myself to stay. During the day, I built up the fire pit and added extra wood. I made sure I had my knife, my bear spray, and a metal tent stake within reach. I checked my phone, even though I hadn't had signal since I left the car. Still nothing. Before the sun went down, I walked the perimeter again. About 50 yards from camp, I found something I hadn't seen before. A patch of ground where the leaves had been brushed away. Not a full path, but a spot where it looked like something or someone had stood. A spot with clearer soil and a long scuff mark. I stared at it for a long time. Then I walked back to camp. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat upright inside the tent, flashlight off, just listening. The forest outside was quiet. Too quiet. Not even birds. No insects. Just this thick, heavy silence. Then, sometime around 2 in the morning, I heard the crunch of leaves again. It was coming straight toward me. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't trying to sneak. The steps were slow, deliberate, moving through the undergrowth toward my tent. I clenched the bear spray in one hand and kept my other hand near the zipper of the tent flap. The steps stopped a few feet away. I could hear breathing again. Soft, steady. Then nothing. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. Still nothing. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped out slowly. That's when I saw the footprint. It was in the soft dirt by the edge of the clearing. A boot print. Definitely not mine. It was larger than mine and the tread was different. I scanned the woods in every direction. Nothing moved. I packed up as fast as I could. Tent, stove, food bag, everything jammed into my pack. I didn't even eat. I hiked out without stopping. I didn't look back. I didn't take photos. I just kept moving until I reached the car. The white Subaru was gone. I threw my pack into the back seat, started the engine, and drove until I hit the nearest gas station with a signal. I never reported it. I didn't know what I would have said. There wasn't a crime. There was no proof. Just footprints, sounds, and a feeling I can't explain. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. I haven't gone camping alone since. I didn't plan the trip very well, and I'll be the first to admit that. I wanted to get away for a weekend and clear my head, and I picked a random area in the state I'd never been to before. A quiet patch of forest somewhere near the base of the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania. I don't remember the exact name of the trailhead, but I found it on a hiking forum, and it had just enough information to feel legit without looking touristy. It sounded like what I wanted. No crowds, no campsites, no rules. Just trees, dirt, and time to be alone. I packed my gear on a Thursday night, slept maybe 3 hours, and drove out early the next morning with a thermos of stale coffee and a half-eaten breakfast burrito from a gas station I don't think I could find again if I tried. I got to the trailhead a little after 10 in the morning. It was a cracked gravel lot with a rusted metal sign and no cars. I remember that specifically. No cars at all. It was quiet in a way that makes you stop and notice it. No birdsong, no wind, just the crunch of my boots on gravel and the low ticking sound of my cooling engine. I shut the car off, left the keys buried under the floor mat just in case something happened to me and someone needed to find them, and started the hike in. I had everything I needed: tent, water filter, freeze-dried food, matches, a knife, a basic med kit, a paper map I printed at home, and my old hiking pack with the right weight balance. I've done enough solo trips to know what can go wrong. I thought I was ready for anything. The hike in was uneventful for the first couple of hours. The trail wasn't marked, but the path was visible if you paid attention. Mostly just a flattened corridor through the trees, winding gently uphill. I walked for maybe 3 hours at a steady pace before I decided to start looking for a place to set up camp. I wanted to be far enough from the car that I wouldn't hear any sounds from the road, and this seemed like the perfect spot. I found a flat, elevated patch of ground just off the trail, partially surrounded by a thicket of young pines. Good natural windbreak, close to a small creek maybe 30 feet downhill. The sun was out but filtered through the trees, and everything smelled like damp leaves and pine needles. I dropped my pack, stretched, and started setting up the tent. It was one of those lightweight two-pole kinds, quick to pitch and solid if staked down right. I took my time with it, making sure everything was taut. I collected firewood for later and filtered some water from the creek. I remember the water was clear and freezing cold, and I knelt there for a while just watching it run past the rocks, listening to the soft rush of it. For a few hours, it felt exactly like I'd wanted, peaceful, still, like the rest of the world had shut off. That changed later around dusk. It started with the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not in a supernatural way, nothing dramatic like that. Just a slow, creeping sensation like I was being watched. I brushed it off at first. It happens sometimes when you're alone in the woods for too long. Your brain starts to play tricks on you, fills in silence with paranoia. But then I noticed something that made me stop pretending it was just in my head. There were fresh tracks on the trail. Not boot prints, bare feet, human feet, medium-sized, going the opposite direction from where I'd come. The mud was still wet in the depressions, not dry and cracked like mine were. I followed them for a few feet with my eyes before they disappeared into the underbrush. No path, no direction, just straight off the trail and into the woods. I stood there for a while, listening. Nothing. No twigs snapping, no animals, no voice. I looked up at the sky, then back at the prints, then back toward my camp. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it was already late, and I didn't want to hike in the dark. I told myself someone else must have come out here. Maybe a forager, someone off-grid, or even another camper who preferred walking barefoot. Strange, sure, but not impossible. I went back to camp and lit a fire, even though I didn't plan to. I thought it might help settle my nerves. I boiled water, made some food, and sat there watching the flames dance while the light slowly died behind the trees. The night settled in hard and fast. The stars came out, and the temperature dropped quick. I layered up, zipped into my bag, and tried to sleep. I woke up to the sound of branches cracking somewhere close. Not like a squirrel or raccoon. Heavier. 2 short cracks, then silence. I stayed completely still. The fire had died down to glowing coals, and everything was dark except for the faint red light from the embers. I couldn't see anything outside the tent, but I knew someone was out there. I could hear breathing, not an animal sniffing around. Breathing, human, slow, controlled, like someone trying to be quiet. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent or grab my knife or turn on my flashlight. I just lay there listening, heart thudding so hard I thought it would give me away. The breathing stayed steady for a while, then faded. Not suddenly, just slowly got quieter until I couldn't hear it anymore. I waited another hour before I even moved. When I finally unzipped the tent and looked out, there was nothing. No tracks, no shapes in the trees. I stayed awake until the sky started to lighten. That morning I found something that changed everything. On a low branch near the creek, tied loosely with what looked like vines, was a strip of fabric. Dark, reddish-brown. Could have been part of a shirt or pants. It was frayed and stained. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it for a long time. It hadn't been there the day before. I would have seen it. I'm sure of that. I went back to the tent and packed up fast. I didn't eat. I didn't refill my water. I just got my gear together and started hiking back down the trail. I checked my map a few times to stay on track, but the trail seemed off, like the turns weren't quite where they were supposed to be. I kept moving anyway. About 2 hours into the hike, I found something that stopped me cold. A shelter. Not a real one, something handmade. Just a few thick branches leaned against a tree trunk and covered in dried pine needles and bark. It wasn't obvious. I only noticed it because a squirrel darted across the trail and disappeared into it. I looked inside. There was nothing in there. No bedding, no gear. But it had been used. The ground inside was packed flat. And around the edges, almost hidden by leaves, were small piles of bones. Animal bones, mostly, but one looked too long, too straight. I didn't stay to figure out what it was. I backed out, turned around, and kept walking. The trail kept feeling unfamiliar, like it shifted when I wasn't looking. Trees that I'd passed before looked different in the light. Some stumps I was sure I'd seen on the way in were missing. I stopped trusting my memory. I started checking my compass every few minutes. The direction stayed consistent, at least. South, toward the trailhead. I kept moving. Sometime in the afternoon I found my own boot prints. The ones I'd made the day before. But they weren't right. They were mixed with more barefoot tracks. Too many, overlapping, going in all directions. It looked like someone had been following me, watching where I walked, maybe even stepping where I stepped. I wanted to run, but I knew better. Running just leads to mistakes. So I walked, as fast as I could without making noise, checking behind me every few steps. When I finally saw the parking lot again, I almost cried. My car was still there. The sun was low, sky tinged with orange. I ran the last 50 feet, heart hammering, and yanked open the driver's side door. The inside was exactly how I left it. I didn't check the back seat. I just started the engine and peeled out, gravel spraying behind me. I drove for an hour before I pulled over at a gas station. I checked the whole car. Nothing. No one. No signs of anyone having been inside. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for a while. I didn't want to sound crazy. It was weeks before I went back to the woods again, and even then, I stuck to busy trails. I never found that forum post again. The trailhead disappeared from my saved pages. I don't know if it was deleted or if I imagined it differently, but I know I wasn't alone out there. Someone lives in those woods. Maybe not on any map, maybe not someone you'd ever meet in a town, but someone with bare feet and quiet breathing. Someone who watches. And that strip of fabric is in a plastic bag in the bottom drawer of my desk. I don't know why I took it. I didn't touch it with my hands. I used a stick. Maybe I needed proof. A reminder. I haven't been back to that part of the state. I probably never will. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night and it's dead silent, I think I hear breathing again. Slow, measured, just outside the window. I get up. I check. There's never anything there, but I still check. Every time. It was just supposed to be a weekend getaway. A few days to escape the noise of the city, get away from work, and clear my head. I found this little cabin in the woods, tucked away far enough that no one could hear you scream, though I wasn't expecting that to be something I'd think about. The cabin was old, but sturdy. It had that worn-down charm that made it feel lived in, like it had stories to tell. I figured it would be a perfect retreat for some quiet time. I could get some reading done, maybe even write a bit, but I certainly didn't plan on anything else. The drive up was beautiful. The leaves on the trees were turning, painting the landscape in rich yellows, oranges, and reds. It wasn't too cold yet, but the chill of autumn was settling in. When I pulled into the small gravel parking area, the cabin seemed to appear out of nowhere, almost as if the trees had parted to let me in. The wood had a deep, weathered brown color, the kind of wood that felt alive, as if it had been shaped by countless years of rain and sun. It wasn't huge, just a small one-bedroom, but enough for me. The door creaked when I opened it. The smell of aged pine and old wood hit me immediately, followed by the scent of a wood stove that had been unused for a while. I set down my bag and took a moment to soak it all in. There was something soothing about the quiet, something I hadn't realized I needed until that very moment. I closed the door behind me, kicked off my boots, and looked around. The place was exactly what I needed. It had a rustic charm. Simple furniture, an old rocking chair by the window, a few mismatched rugs on the wooden floor. The kitchen area was small but functional, with a stove that looked like it had been there since the cabin was first built. A single bed, an antique dresser, and a worn-out armchair in the corner completed the room. Everything seemed to have a history. The place was perfect. I unpacked my things and started a fire in the stove, careful to get the kindling just right. The warmth from the fire filled the room, and I pulled a blanket from the bed, settling into the armchair to read a book I'd brought. Hours passed without me even realizing it. The peaceful silence was comforting, and the crackling of the fire added a rhythm to the quiet. But as night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a creeping sense of unease that settled in with the dark. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my book, but I kept glancing up at the window, where the blackness of the forest outside pressed in. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and the cabin creaked every now and then, which I chalked up to the old wood settling. Still, that feeling gnawed at me like someone or something was just beyond the trees watching. I tried to shake it off. There was nothing out there. I was just being paranoid. By the time I finished my book and got ready for bed, I decided to make the most of the situation. The fire had burned down to embers, and the warmth in the room had faded. I blew out the candle on the table, pulled the covers up, and tried to sleep. But the night didn't feel right. It was too quiet. I was used to the occasional sounds of animals, the chirp of crickets, the rustling of leaves. But here, in this deep forest, there was nothing. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. I turned in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there for hours, my mind racing. I kept hearing soft sounds, like something scraping against the cabin's walls, or footsteps moving just outside the window. But every time I looked, there was nothing. I wasn't sure whether it was the darkness playing tricks on me or if something really was out there. The wind outside started picking up again, but it didn't feel like wind. It felt different. The trees groaned, and I could almost hear them bending and swaying in ways that felt unnatural. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and decided to step outside to see what was going on. I pulled on my boots and stepped onto the wooden porch. The night air was colder than I expected, sending a chill straight through my jacket. I clicked on the flashlight and scanned the area. The beams swept over the trees, the ground, but there was nothing. No movement, no rustling, no sign of life. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the anxiety that had been building. Everything seemed still now, but the feeling didn't leave. The darkness felt thicker here, as though it was somehow more real. I didn't want to go back inside, not just yet, so I started walking around the cabin, flashlight in hand, checking for anything that could explain the sounds. I didn't find anything out of the ordinary, just trees, rocks, and the occasional bush. But when I came around to the back of the cabin, I saw something odd. There was a small clearing just beyond the tree line, and there, at the edge of the clearing, was a pile of broken branches, twisted and piled up in a way that seemed deliberate. It was too neat, too arranged to be natural. My heart started pounding as I stood there, staring at it. I wanted to go back inside, lock the door, and forget about it, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I approached the pile cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of movement, but it was silent, too silent. As I stood there, my mind started to race with all the worst possible scenarios. Someone had been here watching me. Maybe they were still out there, hiding, waiting for me to turn my back. I knew I had to go back inside, but the thought of turning around and walking back into that cabin, alone, made my skin crawl. But then, something shifted. I heard it, a snap as though a branch had broken underfoot. I froze, straining my ears, but there was no sound after that. It was just the wind again, right? I turned quickly, scanning the darkness once more. My breath came out in quick bursts now. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, in the trees, watching. I made the decision to go back inside. I didn't care how ridiculous it seemed. The cabin was safety, and that was all that mattered. But just as I turned to head back to the porch, I heard the snap again, closer this time. My heart skipped a beat. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were close. I broke into a run, sprinting back toward the cabin, my boots thudding against the wooden steps. I burst inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it behind me. My mind was racing, and my pulse was loud in my ears. I didn't know what I'd heard, but I wasn't taking any chances. I closed the curtains, double-checked the windows, and settled on the couch, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, the sun rose, and everything felt normal again. The cabin was still standing, the trees were still just trees, and there was no sign of any danger. But the unease hadn't disappeared. Something didn't feel right, like there was something I was missing, some small detail I hadn't noticed. I spent the day inside, not daring to go outside again. I thought about leaving, packing up and heading back to the city, but I didn't want to let fear win. So I stayed. The next few days passed without incident. I kept myself busy, reading, writing, exploring the woods in daylight, but always staying close to the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I had no concrete reason for it. Eventually, I decided I'd leave a day earlier than planned. I packed my things, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. But as I stepped outside, I froze. In the clearing by the trees, the pile of branches was gone. It was as though it had never been there. I don't know what happened that night or who or what was out there, but when I left, I did it in a hurry. I didn't look back. I don't care to know if there was someone watching me or if I just let my imagination get the better of me. What I do know is that I never want to go back to that cabin. Some things are better left alone. The sun had just set, leaving behind the last streaks of orange across the sky. I sat by the edge of the campfire, the crackling of the wood the only sound breaking the night's silence. It had been a quiet afternoon, the kind of calm I was hoping for when I decided to take this solo camping trip. There was something therapeutic about being away from everything. Away from work, away from people, and away from the usual noise of life. This was the first time in a while I could just breathe, stretch out my thoughts, and let everything fade into the background. I had set up camp near a small, remote lake. The path leading to it had been long, and the trail was almost overgrown, as if nature had been trying to reclaim it. But that made it perfect for someone like me, who was seeking solitude. I hadn't seen a single person since the trailhead, and the only sounds around me were the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. The lake, reflecting the deepening blue sky, seemed so serene. It was just me, my tent, and the crackling fire. As I poked the fire with a stick, the orange embers burst up into the night air, creating tiny sparks that scattered briefly before fading into the darkness. I tossed a few more logs on the fire, the smell of burning wood mixing with the fresh scent of pine. Everything felt right, peaceful. I wrapped myself in my jacket and leaned back against the log I had been sitting on, letting the warmth from the fire seep into my skin. There were no plans, no rush, just me and the wilderness. The wind picked up a bit, rustling the trees around me. I shivered slightly as the temperature dropped, but I wasn't worried. I had brought a heavy sleeping bag, and the fire would keep me warm enough for the night. As I stared at the flames, I found myself growing drowsy. It had been a long day of hiking, and despite the fact that I was alone in this vast stretch of forest, I didn't feel afraid. I was used to being out in the wilderness. This was my third solo camping trip, and nothing had ever gone wrong before. The worst thing I had experienced was a raccoon stealing my food. But as the minutes passed, something about the quietness of this place started to feel a little off. It was subtle at first, like a low hum in the back of my mind. There were no more animal sounds, no distant calls from birds or the occasional rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. It was as though the world around me had held its breath, waiting for something. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The solitude was starting to get to me, that was all. I had a habit of overthinking when I was alone too long. But then, as I stared at the fire, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A twig snapped, somewhere just beyond the light of my campfire. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up straight, my eyes scanning the darkness around me. The wind had stopped completely, and everything was still. Too still. It was probably just an animal. There were plenty of small creatures in the woods, and the forest was full of life, even if I couldn't see it. Still, the snap of the twig had been too loud, too distinct. I tried to push the thought from my mind and focus on the fire, but my ears strained for any other sounds. Nothing came, just the steady, rhythmic crackling of the fire. Minutes passed. The fire continued to burn, and the woods stayed quiet. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer or a raccoon had wandered too close. I'd heard strange sounds like that before on camping trips, and they were always easily explained away. But then I heard it again, a faint rustling, followed by another sharp snap of a twig. This time it was closer, much closer. I froze, my blood running cold. My mind raced, running through possibilities. I knew there were bears in these woods, but they weren't usually this close to camp. I had hung my food in a tree, well away from the tent, just in case. Still, the idea of a bear wandering nearby made my skin crawl. The sound came again, and this time it was unmistakable. A soft shuffle, like footsteps. Someone, or something, was moving through the forest near my camp. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up as my heart pounded in my chest. Whoever or whatever was out there, I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking as I clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the dark, revealing the forest around me, but nothing stood out. The trees, the underbrush, everything seemed normal. I could hear the faint sound of my own breathing as I scanned the area. But there was no one there, no animal, no figure, just the dark, silent trees. I slowly stood up, keeping my eyes fixed on the shadows just beyond the light. My body felt tense, my muscles tight as I clutched the flashlight in one hand, a heavy stick in the other. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I wasn't taking any chances. Whatever had been out there, I wasn't going to be caught off guard. Minutes ticked by, and I stood motionless by the fire, the light of the flames flickering across the trees. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. Maybe it was just a deer. Maybe it was just the wind again, playing tricks on me. I wasn't sure. But then, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were clearer, closer. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving toward me. The sound was deliberate, too precise to be an animal. I could hear it moving through the brush, the faint rustle of leaves and the soft snap of twigs underfoot. I spun around, my flashlight casting erratic beams across the forest, but I saw nothing. There was nothing there, nothing I could point to. My heart pounded in my chest as panic began to settle in. I tried to steady my breath, telling myself it was nothing, that it was just the wind or some other natural explanation. But something deep inside me told me that wasn't the case. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing, just the eerie silence of the night. My breath came out in shallow gasps as I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. I kept the light trained on the trees, my eyes scanning the shadows. I had no idea who or what was out there, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. The unease that had been creeping up on me all night was now a heavy weight in my stomach. It wasn't just a bear. It wasn't just an animal. This felt different. I took a slow step back toward my tent, my eyes never leaving the darkness beyond the fire. Every rustle, every shift in the wind made me jump. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was suffocating. I wasn't alone out here. That much was clear. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a shadow moving between the trees, just beyond the range of my flashlight. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow was tall, slender, and moving with purpose. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a figure slipping between the trees. My heart hammered in my chest as I quickly ducked down behind a large boulder near the fire. I had no idea what it was, but it was too big, too deliberate to be some random animal. The silence stretched on, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It grew stronger, more oppressive. Whoever or whatever it was still out there, just out of sight, waiting. I tried to calm myself, to think. Should I leave? Should I pack up and hike back to the trailhead, where I might be able to find help? The thought of running in the dark, of stumbling through the woods, made my stomach churn. But staying wasn't an option either. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I grabbed my things, my backpack, my sleeping bag, and shoved them into the tent. I didn't bother folding anything properly. I just needed to move. But as I hurriedly packed up, the footsteps returned. Slow, deliberate, moving toward me. I froze. My body was on alert. Every muscle tensed as I waited for the next sound. My heart pounded so loud in my ears, I was sure it would give me away. The footsteps stopped. There was no sound now, just the quiet hum of the night. Then the voice came. It was faint, barely a whisper carried on the wind. "You shouldn't be here." I didn't know what to do. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew they were close, too close. I backed away from the voice, my hands shaking. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The words echoed in my head. I was alone, but I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath and sprinted. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get away. I wasn't sure how far I ran, how long I stumbled through the trees, until I finally broke into the open. My eyes blurred with tears as I gasped for breath, my body shaking from the rush of adrenaline. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead. The familiar sign of the path back to civilization was a relief, but I didn't look back. Not once. The next day, I went back to the site with a park ranger. My camp was untouched, the fire long gone cold. There were no signs of anything out of the ordinary. No footprints, no broken branches. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. My friends and I had planned a trip to a remote cabin tucked away in the woods for a weekend of peace, relaxation, and a bit of hiking. The idea of being away from the hustle and bustle of daily life felt like the perfect way to recharge. It was early fall. The leaves had started to turn golden, and the air had a crisp bite to it that made it feel like everything was fresh and new. The cabin was located somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, in a part of West Virginia where cell service was non-existent, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The sort of place where the only sounds you'd hear at night were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. I had rented the place online after seeing a couple of photos, nothing fancy, but exactly what we were looking for. A simple, secluded cabin with a fireplace, a porch with a view, and a couple of old wooden rocking chairs on it. A place to get away from everything. The website mentioned how the cabin had been built in the 1960s, and from the photos, it looked like it hadn't changed much since then. I liked that. It was part of its charm. I packed my bags the night before the trip, feeling excited but also a little uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on why I felt that way, but I chalked it up to the nerves I always get before heading into unfamiliar places. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't dread, just a sense of something unknown lurking just under the surface. The drive there was long, about 4 hours from the city, and the road narrowed the further we went. We passed small towns, then dirt roads, and eventually found ourselves on a gravel path that twisted through dense woods. My friend, Ben, who had driven most of the way, was starting to get a little irritated. He'd had a rough week at work, and I could tell the winding roads were testing his patience. The sun was setting by the time we finally reached the cabin, and the darkening sky made the place look even more isolated. There were no other houses in sight. I wasn't sure if I liked that or not, but it was too late to turn back now. I was eager to get inside, unpack, and start the weekend. We parked the car in front of the cabin and unloaded our things. The cabin looked exactly as I had remembered from the pictures. A 2-story wooden structure with a steep roof, a chimney, and large windows that let in a lot of light. The porch was covered with a thick layer of dust, but it still had its charm. The kind of charm you'd expect from a place that had seen many seasons, but had remained mostly untouched by time. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine wood and a slight musky scent that I couldn't place. The living room was modest, with a stone fireplace, an old wooden coffee table, and a couple of worn-out sofas. There was a small kitchen to the left and a staircase leading up to the bedrooms on the second floor. The wood beams in the ceiling were dark, and the floor creaked under our footsteps. It felt like a place frozen in time. And in some strange way, I liked that. We set up for the night, lit a fire in the fireplace, and unpacked our food and drinks. Ben opened a few beers, and we all sat around the fire, talking about random stuff. It felt good to be away from everything, to just relax and enjoy the company. The weather outside had turned cooler, and the wind started to pick up, making the trees outside sway and groan. That's when I started feeling it. The quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind of silence that feels a bit too heavy. It wasn't like the world had stopped, but more like something was missing. I shook it off, though. I was just being paranoid, I thought. The others were all having a good time, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin the mood. As the night wore on, we decided to head to bed. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs, and we each took one. I ended up in the larger room at the front of the cabin, with a big window that faced the woods. The curtains were heavy, and I pulled them shut before lying down. The bed was comfortable enough, but the creaking of the old wooden frame kept me tossing and turning. I found myself staring out the window in the dark, the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. Around midnight, I finally managed to drift off to sleep, but the peace didn't last long. I woke up to the sound of a loud thud. It was the kind of sound that made you sit up straight in bed, heart pounding. I froze, listening. The house was silent again. I couldn't figure out what it was. Maybe an animal outside, or a branch hitting the roof. I tried to go back to sleep, but something was nagging at me. I kept hearing small noises, the kind you might ignore in a normal house, but in a place this isolated, they felt amplified. A few hours passed, and I finally fell back into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The cabin was still cold, but the sun was starting to rise, casting a pale orange light over everything. I rubbed my eyes and sat up in bed, feeling groggy. I decided to head downstairs to make some coffee. Ben was already in the kitchen making breakfast. He looked tired, his face pale. "Did you hear anything last night?" he asked, without looking up from the stove. I didn't know how to respond. I hadn't told anyone about the noises, but hearing him bring it up made me feel a little less crazy. "Yeah, actually, a few weird sounds, like something bumping against the house." Ben nodded. "Same here. I thought it was an animal, but I don't know. It didn't sound like that." We shrugged it off, though. It was probably just the house settling or an animal in the woods. Nothing to get worked up over. The day passed uneventfully. We went for a hike up the nearby trail, passing through dense forest, and even stumbled upon a small stream where we stopped for a bit. It was a beautiful spot, quiet and serene. We talked about everything and nothing, enjoying the simplicity of being away from the city. That night, we made a big dinner, grilled steaks and vegetables over the fire. The night sky was clear, and we spent a few hours sitting outside, watching the stars. But again, as the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy. It was like something was watching us, though I couldn't explain why I felt that way. We all went to bed early that night, and I tried to sleep as quickly as I could. But it wasn't long before the noises started again. First, a small knock, then another thud, followed by the sound of something scraping against the wood. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The house felt too still, too quiet. I got up and went to check the windows. Nothing outside. No animals, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But I still couldn't shake the feeling. It was like I was being watched from the shadows of the trees, even though I knew that was impossible. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump, and I found myself listening to the wind howling outside, wondering if it was just the trees causing the strange sounds. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound again. This time it was louder, and it definitely came from inside the house. I grabbed my flashlight and crept down the stairs. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but I didn't care. I had to know what was happening. The house was dark and still, and I moved through it cautiously, shining the light on everything. The kitchen was empty, the living room too. That's when I heard it. A soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being moved across the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed the sound, reaching the basement door at the end of the hallway. The door was ajar, and I could see a faint light flickering from below. I didn't want to go down there. I wanted to turn around, go back upstairs, and pretend this was all in my head. But my legs moved on their own, and I descended into the darkness. What I found in the basement was enough to make me freeze in terror. There, in the far corner of the basement, was a pile of old furniture. Broken chairs, dusty boxes, and an old wooden cabinet. And next to it, there was a trapdoor in the floor, half hidden by the furniture. The dragging noise had come from this door. Someone or something had been moving it. I don't know why, but I walked closer to it. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle, my flashlight trembling in my grip. With one hard pull, the trapdoor creaked open. Underneath was a narrow, dark space, almost like a crawl space. And in the very center of it, there was something. A bundle, wrapped in a tattered sheet. I couldn't make out what it was at first, but when I shone the flashlight on it, my stomach dropped. It was a pile of old clothes, and under them there was something that looked like a bag. A human-sized bag. A bag that had been sitting there, hidden for who knows how long. I felt my body go numb, and I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. My mind was racing, and I had to force myself to think clearly. Someone had been down there. Someone had been hiding in the basement, and they had left whatever it was down there. I ran upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't even hear my own footsteps over the blood rushing in my ears. I reached my friends' rooms, waking them up, and we decided to leave. We packed our things in a hurry, not even bothering to lock the door behind us. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin. The lights were still on, the porch empty. I didn't know what had been hidden under that trapdoor, but I knew one thing for sure. We weren't coming back. It was the middle of autumn when I decided to get away from the noise of the city. I was 27, feeling the weight of a few too many late nights at work, too many stressful deadlines, and too many evenings spent surrounded by people I barely knew. I needed quiet. I needed solitude. So, when I stumbled upon an ad online for a small cabin in the woods, tucked away near a lake about 2 hours from where I lived, I booked it. No second thoughts, no hesitation. The cabin was an old one, built somewhere in the late 70s, according to the owner. He seemed like the type who didn't really care much for modern amenities or technology, and I was okay with that. I wanted the disconnection, the peace, and the raw simplicity of nature. I wanted to be cut off. I packed only the basics: clothes, food, some books, and a few things to make the cabin more comfortable. The car ride out there was pleasant enough, though the roads grew more uneven as I drove farther from the nearest town. The deeper I got into the woods, the more I felt the weight of isolation settle over me. When I finally arrived, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the cabin. It was smaller than I had imagined, but it had character. The wooden beams were worn and weathered by time, but the place felt solid. There were no neighbors, no signs of civilization. Just trees, dirt roads, and the constant murmur of the nearby lake. The only thing that could be heard was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I unloaded my car, carried my bags inside, and immediately began setting up. The cabin had an old stove, a few mismatched chairs, a small fireplace, and a single bedroom with a bed that creaked whenever you moved. The walls were lined with shelves full of old books, some of which I planned to read. I could already feel the stress of the city beginning to fade. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple dinner over the stove, set up a fire, and settled in with a book. I didn't feel scared, not even a little. The solitude was peaceful. I went to bed early, wrapped up in the warmth of the blankets, listening to the sounds of the woods outside. But then, on the second night, things started to change. It was about midnight when I was awoken by a noise. I wasn't sure what it was at first. A creak? A knock? My mind raced through the possibilities. Branches brushing against the cabin, the wind howling, or maybe just the house settling. I tried to ignore it, turning over and pulling the blanket tighter around me. But the noise came again, louder this time. A thud, a scraping sound. My heart rate quickened, and I couldn't dismiss it. Something wasn't right. I got out of bed, careful not to make too much noise. The cabin was dark, with only the faint glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. I grabbed a flashlight and moved to the window. Outside, it was pitch black, except for the occasional flicker of moonlight through the trees. I couldn't see anything moving, nothing that would explain the sound. But the air felt different, heavier, colder, almost oppressive. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. The woods were strange, after all, and the isolation played tricks on your mind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent the next hour checking the locks on all the windows and doors, double-checking that everything was in place. It was fine, I told myself. It had to be. After all, I was alone in a cabin, miles away from anyone. There was no reason to be afraid. But I couldn't get back to sleep. Every noise outside, every rustle of leaves, made my muscles tense. I lay there, listening to the stillness of the night, hoping for it to pass. The following morning, I woke up exhausted, but I decided to ignore the unease I felt. I made some coffee and spent the day outside, walking by the lake, breathing in the fresh air, and trying to clear my head. The weather was chilly, but the sun was out, and the autumn colors were in full swing. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about the silence. Even though there were birds, insects, and the occasional animal moving through the trees, it felt as if the forest was holding its breath. It was too quiet. No distant hum of traffic, no sounds of people. Just me and the endless stretch of trees. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard the noise again. This time it was closer, coming from the back of the cabin. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. This was something more deliberate, something human. I froze, my hand stilling over the stove. My heart skipped a beat. I set the spatula down slowly, then crept to the back window, the one that faced the forest. Nothing. No one. I checked the back door, locked. All the windows were shut, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. Someone watching me. By the third night, the sense of unease had grown to a palpable fear. I hadn't heard anything during the day, but every time the wind picked up, I felt like I was being surrounded. I locked every door and window again, but this time, I didn't feel safe. Every creak of the wood, every distant thud made my skin crawl. I made the decision to leave. It wasn't worth staying in a place that made me feel like this. But as I began packing my things, I noticed something strange. My car keys were missing. I searched the cabin from top to bottom, going through every drawer, every shelf, even checking the fireplace, but the keys were gone. There was no way I could have misplaced them. I hadn't even taken them out of my pocket since I arrived. At this point, panic started setting in. I checked my phone, but there was no service, no bars, no connection to the outside world. That's when I heard it again, this time unmistakable. A heavy knock at the front door. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Someone was definitely out there. I didn't know what to do. There was no way I was opening the door, not with whatever or whoever was on the other side. I grabbed the axe from the corner by the fireplace, the only tool that could offer any kind of protection, and waited. Minutes passed, but nothing happened. The knock didn't come again. The air was still, but the unease didn't leave. I stayed awake, listening for any more sounds, for anything that would give me a clue about what was going on. But it was quiet again, as if the world had gone still. The next morning, I found my car keys on the front step. No sign of anyone, no footprints in the dirt. It was as if the night had never happened. But I couldn't leave fast enough. I packed up everything and got in my car, started the engine, and drove off. As I passed the long stretch of road leading out of the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone had been watching me the entire time, and that whatever it was still out there, waiting. I don't know what happened out there, but I do know one thing: I've never gone back, and I don't plan to. There are places in this world that you just don't go. There are things in the woods that you don't want to find, and some things are better left undiscovered. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. A few days alone in a remote cabin, deep in the woods, away from everything. No phone service, no distractions, just quiet. That was the plan. I had rented the cabin from a small listing I found online. It was old, simple, and far from any major roads. It had been used mostly as a hunting cabin, according to the description. There was a single dirt path leading to it, barely wide enough for my truck. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive out took longer than expected. The last stretch was rough, the road uneven, potholes filled with water from recent rain. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin itself looked like something from an old photograph. Weathered wood, a small porch, and a tin roof. It stood alone, surrounded by thick forest. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I parked and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. There was no noise except for the occasional rustling of leaves. No cars, no people, just silence. I liked it. The inside of the cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchen area, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a couch against the far wall. A door led to a tiny bedroom with a single bed, and there was a bathroom with an old shower that barely worked. It wasn't luxury, but it was what I needed. I unpacked my things, set up my sleeping bag on the bed, and started a fire in the old wood stove. The temperature had dropped fast, and the warmth was welcome. I made a quick meal, ate at the table, and then sat on the porch for a while, watching the woods darken. The trees were so thick that once the sun was gone, it felt like the world ended just beyond the cabin's small clearing. That night, I slept lightly. The bed was uncomfortable, and the wind outside made the trees creak. I woke up a few times, feeling like something had disturbed me, but there was nothing, just the silence pressing in. At some point, I fell into a deeper sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The fire had died, and the air inside was cold. I got up, stretched, and went outside to gather some firewood. The cabin had a small shed a few yards away, stocked with dry logs. As I walked over, I noticed something that made me stop. There were footprints in the dirt. Not mine. They were fresh, leading from the woods to the porch, stopping right at the front door. Then they turned and went back into the trees. They were deep, meaning whoever left them was heavy, maybe wearing boots. My own tracks from the day before were still visible, but these were new. I stood there, staring at them. It didn't make sense. No one should have been out here. I had heard nothing during the night. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick. It wasn't the kind of place you just wandered through by accident. I shook off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was probably an old hunter passing through. Maybe they saw the cabin, got curious, and left. That made sense. Still, I felt unsettled. I brought the firewood inside, lit the stove again, and made some coffee. The warmth helped, but the thought of those footprints stuck with me. I spent most of the day hiking around the area, exploring a little. The woods were dense, but I found an old overgrown trail that seemed to lead somewhere deeper. I followed it for a while before turning back, not wanting to go too far from the cabin. By the time I got back, the sun was already starting to set. I cooked a quick meal, ate, and then sat by the fire, listening to the wood crackle. Outside, the woods had gone silent again. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence, it felt different, heavy, like something was out there, just beyond the tree line. That night, I woke up again, but this time I knew why. There was a sound outside. Slow, steady footsteps, moving around the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding. The footsteps weren't hurried, not like an animal moving through the underbrush. They were deliberate, careful. They stopped near the porch. Then silence. I reached for the flashlight next to my bed, gripping it tightly. I listened, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the silence was messing with my mind. But I knew that wasn't true. Someone had been outside. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When it did, I went outside immediately, scanning the ground. The footprints were there again. Fresh. They circled the cabin this time. Whoever it was had walked around it, stopping at the windows, the door, watching. I decided to leave. Whatever peaceful trip I had planned was over. I packed quickly, throwing everything into my bag. I didn't bother with breakfast. As I loaded my things into the truck, I glanced back at the woods. Nothing moved, but I felt something there, watching. The drive back was tense. Every time I glanced in the mirror, I expected to see someone step out of the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching ahead. When I finally reached town, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. The silence of that forest, those slow, deliberate footsteps in the night, I couldn't shake it. I never went back to that cabin. I never even tried to find out who had been there. Some things, I think, are better left unknown. I had been planning this solo camping trip for a while. Work had been stressful, and I needed some time alone in the woods to clear my head. I chose a remote location deep in the forest, far from any marked trails. I didn't want to deal with other campers. I wanted silence, just me and nature. The drive was long, taking me through winding mountain roads before I reached the rough dirt path leading to the forest. I parked my truck at the end of the trail, grabbed my gear, and started hiking in. The plan was simple. Hike about 10 miles in, set up camp by a small river I had seen on the map, and spend a few nights unwinding. I had packed enough supplies, food, water, a sturdy tent, and my hunting knife, just in case. The hike in was peaceful at first. The air smelled like pine, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I felt good, away from the noise of the city. But about 5 miles in, I started feeling uneasy. There was no obvious reason for it. No strange noises, no signs of anything off, but something about the silence felt wrong. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing and boots crunching against the dirt. I shook it off and kept walking, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but that feeling of being watched never left. I reached the river just before sunset and quickly set up my tent. The river was exactly as I had imagined, calm, clear, and surrounded by thick trees. I filtered some water, cooked a simple meal, and sat by the fire, trying to enjoy the moment. As darkness settled in, I felt that uneasiness return. It was too quiet. Normally, you'd hear owls or crickets by now, but there was nothing. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was being paranoid. I crawled into my tent and forced myself to sleep. A sound woke me up in the middle of the night. It was faint, like something moving through the trees. I lay still, listening. It wasn't the wind. There was a deliberate pattern to it, like footsteps. Slow, careful steps. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it was just an animal and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. About 30 feet from my campsite, there were footprints. Human footprints, barefoot. They circled my tent. Someone had been here watching me while I slept. I packed up immediately. My plan was to leave right away, but as I looked at the trail I had come from, something felt wrong. The footprints weren't just near my tent. They led back into the forest. And worse, they weren't alone. There were more prints now, like multiple people had been walking around. The realization sent a chill through me. I wasn't alone out here. I kept my knife in my hand as I started walking back. I moved quickly, but carefully, keeping my eyes on the trees around me. Every now and then, I heard something, branches snapping, faint rustling in the distance. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was following me. I forced myself to stay calm. Running would be a mistake. I could twist my ankle, get lost, or make too much noise. But I picked up my pace, my heart pounding. The sounds behind me grew louder, more frequent. Whoever they were, they weren't trying to be quiet anymore. Then I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a tree ahead of me was a bundle of sticks tied together with what looked like old, rotting fabric. It wasn't random. It was placed there, meant to be seen. I didn't stop to examine it. I kept moving, my breathing sharp and fast. The sounds behind me turned into full-on footsteps. They were running now. I could hear multiple sets of feet crunching leaves and snapping twigs. I was being hunted. I broke into a sprint. My lungs burned. My legs screamed at me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. The sounds behind me were getting closer. I knew I had only one chance: get to my truck. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the break in the trees. My truck was still there. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. As I yanked it open and jumped inside, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the edge of the trees. I didn't see a face, just a shape, a dark figure stepping back into the shadows. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and peeled out of there so fast I nearly skidded off the dirt road. My hands were trembling. My heart felt like it was about to explode. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main road. I never went back to that forest. I don't know who or what was out there, and I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. Someone had been waiting in those woods, watching, following, and if I had stayed another night, I don't think I would have made it out. I always loved camping alone. There was something about the quiet of the woods, the isolation, and the simplicity of it all that made me feel at peace. I never worried about safety too much. Sure, I brought a knife and a first aid kit, but I never thought anything serious would happen. People go camping all the time. They hike, they set up their tents, they sit by the fire, and then they go home with nothing but sore legs and good memories. That was always my experience, until one particular trip changed everything. I had taken a few days off work and wanted to get away from everything. No emails, no calls, no people. Just me and the wilderness. I found a remote camping area deep in the woods, far from any marked trails. It wasn't an official campground. It was just a place I had found after hours of looking at maps, an area that seemed untouched, perfect for some solitude. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, and my usual essentials. I even brought a small fishing rod, hoping to catch something fresh for dinner. The hike to the spot was long and tough. The terrain was uneven, and at times I had to push through thick undergrowth. But the effort was worth it. When I finally arrived, I found a small clearing near a slow-moving river. The trees around the clearing were tall and dense, blocking most of the wind. The river provided a steady sound of flowing water, which was oddly calming. It was perfect. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the water that I could hear it, but not so close that the ground was damp. I gathered some wood for a fire and got everything in order before the sun set. As the evening came, I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal. The air was crisp but not too cold. It was one of those nights where everything just felt right. I sat by the fire, eating and listening to the sounds of the forest. Occasionally, I would hear a branch snap in the distance or the rustling of leaves, but that was normal. Animals move around at night. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. I had bear spray with me just in case, but I wasn't worried. I had camped enough times to know what to expect. After finishing my meal, I cleaned up and made sure all my food was secured away from my tent. Then, I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep easily, the sounds of the river and the fire dying down lulling me into rest. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. It was pitch black. My fire had gone out completely, and the only sound was the faint trickle of water from the river. I didn't know why I woke up, but something felt off. I lay still, listening, waiting. Then I heard it. Footsteps. not the random noises of animals moving through the underbrush. These were slow, deliberate steps. They were close, too close. I held my breath, straining my ears. The footsteps stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I reached for my flashlight but hesitated. If someone was out there, I didn't want to give away my position. I stayed still, listening, hoping that I was imagining it. Then the footsteps started again. They moved around the clearing, circling my tent. I gripped the knife I kept beside me, my fingers tightening around the handle. The footsteps stopped again, just outside my tent. I could hear breathing, slow, steady breathing. Someone was standing right there. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. Minutes passed, or maybe it was just seconds. Felt like forever. Then, just as quietly as they had come, the footsteps moved away. I listened as they faded into the woods until I could hear nothing but the river again. I stayed awake for hours, barely moving. My mind raced with possibilities. Who was out there? A hunter? Another camper? But why would they come so close to my tent in the middle of the night without saying anything? When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I unzipped my tent slowly and stepped outside. My fire pit was undisturbed. My gear was untouched. But when I looked around the clearing, I saw them, footprints in the dirt. Large, heavy prints that circled my tent, stopping just inches from where I had been sleeping. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. I had planned to stay for a few more nights, but I wasn't going to risk another night out there. I kept my knife in my hand the entire time, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The hike back felt longer than before. Every sound made me jump. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. It wasn't until I was back in my car, doors locked, that I finally let out the breath I had been holding. I never found out who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just another camper who didn't want to announce themselves. Maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I never went camping alone again.